Hello everyone. I am your dark narrator here to guide you today. I know many of you use this video to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also drop a comment letting us know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now settle in, get comfortable, and relax. Why them? That was the first question that edged into all of our minds. Harlow's Institute for Orphans was settled West Yorkshire in Marsden, a beautiful countryside and villages filled with warm, bustling people. Then there's the orphanage. The old building had a soul of its own, one that was bright and innocent, the air was indulging to breathe in. Now it's settled on the large grass field, remote from any civilians for at least half an hour away. The archaic walls surrounded the entire building. They stood upright as it displayed a gloomy, chilling shadow that watched the mornings pass in silence. The black metal gate guarded the entrance of Harlow's Institute, declining any unwanted visitors that stumbled across the building. The gate only parted open when there was a family that wanted to take on board a child of their own, but until then it will stay locked. And it has been locked for a very long time. Every child in the orphanage had to dress to a standard, walk properly, and not talk back to any adult. Our caretakers didn't tolerate any complaints or questions, and it was highly unusual for any older child to ask the common question about when they were going to be adopted. I grew up with many children, some which have started their new lives in the city or ran off to another country. Part of me wished to live in a grand home with my own bedroom and bathroom, not having to share it with other kids. But the other part of me wanted to take my closest friends, and we could all live together and not wake up smelling the damp air that mingled over our heads. Like I said at the start, why them? Our caretakers always threatened each child with the same phrase, "If you want to be adopted, don't misbehave." That was the only thing that kept each of us sane as the days stretched out, our innocent faces morphing into a rebellious teenage smirk. We were the only teens left, and I hope we aren't the last. Then that day came along. Roman Carter sprung into our bedroom as he practically dragged me out of my slumber as my body softly hit the ground. I was lucky I snagged the bottom bunk. He was shouting for me to wake up as he climbed on the ladder to reach Melinda, who woke up in fight or flight response. Roman shot down the ladder as Melinda followed afterwards, a look of confusion and anger plastered across her face. I couldn't help but yell at him for waking us up like that. After all, it was a Saturday and we can sleep in until 10 a.m. You guys have to come downstairs. I'm fucking serious," he added as Melinda rose one of her eyebrows up with a look of rage. In that moment, I could already tell that something was horribly wrong. Roman's eyes pleaded with ours, his light brown curls resting next to his cheeks. Melinda hesitated for a second until she stated, "Roman, what is going on? You look like you saw a ghost." She chuckled, her eyes looking upon the teenage boy that trembled in fear. Valerie, Melinda, follow me." And with that, we both followed Roman down the long, damp hallway towards the concrete stairs that seemed to drag on for ages. It was silent, too silent. We made our way past the younger children's room, the steps creaking and groaning, the only noise that filled my ears as my mind raced in confusion. The last steps, we found ourselves in the hall, a large, dingy room filled with 3 wooden long tables and chairs for each child and adult. Heaps and heaps of eyes and tiny faces fluttered back at us in curiosity. I felt myself stumbling back on a wooden chair. I spotted the groups of strangers that thanked our caretakers, shaking their hands with tears brimming their eyes. That was when I felt a pit of nausea bubble inside of me. I peered at Melinda and Roman, whose eyes were drawn on mine. Silence. Everyone clasped their hands together as the families trotted out of the hall with their adopted teenagers. Faces beamed with joy and surprise. I couldn't feel any of those emotions. I know Roman and Melinda felt the same way. Call me jealous or arrogant, but I just did not understand. You see, every child that ever lived here didn't mind that one of us will be adopted soon enough. In fact, we always told each other how thrilled we would be if that special day comes. The caretakers will never truly comprehend what each of us that live here really feel when it comes to them. Jackson Hills, Logan Reed, Norman Porter, and twins Inessa and Ileana Grove are blessed by new families. Please, children, settle your chattering and hoorays. This is an honor, and we shall all say thank you." Mrs. Powell, the head of the caretakers, exclaimed, as she followed the families and teenagers out the orphanage, the loud, high-pitched voices of kids that thanked the strangers that waved happily back. Then they were gone. and we found ourselves seated at our assigned table, which was filled with stale scrambled eggs, toast, and water. Our table was for the older children, but it was just the three of us now. "I really thought I was going to leave this dump," trailed Melinda as she tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ears. "I don't get it. Out of all the children Mrs. Powell recommended, she chose them," sneered Roman as he avoided eye contact with anyone else but us. "You saw their faces. It was like they were happy," I stuttered, tossing my egg around my plate. "How else would they feel if they got adopted?" Hannah chimed. The small 8-year-old stood next to Roman, who smiled back at her. "Hannah, we talked about this." Yeah. Don't eavesdrop in your talks, but I know it's a top-secret mission to do with the freaks." Hannah excitedly giggled, her 2 brown plaits on either side of her shoulder bouncing as she jumped up and down. It only stopped when Roman clasped his hand around her mouth, and we all shushed Hannah quickly. "Who taught you that word?" I asked, Melinda smirking as Hannah pointed to Roman. But Roman was right. They were freaks, and I will tell you how. Jackson Hills was a troubled kid, always pestering the smaller children by taunting them, taking their things and placing it in his drawer. Some older kids before us said that his parents did very bad things to Jackson, and that was why all the caretakers never allowed him to be alone with any small child. I always knew Roman had this rage against him. He never wanted to be in any room with Jackson, even if there was the caretakers or just me and Melinda. He couldn't stand the thought or see him if he did. Well, he said it himself. He will beat the shit out of Jackson until his body was unrecognizable. The twin girls, Inessa and Ileana Grove, who never separated from each other. Even if we were taking a test or showers before bed, they would never leave. During free time, they would always carry their red rubbered ball and throw it down and catch it back up, then repeat the process until the caretakers ordered us back into our classrooms. When we were 10, there used to be a cat in the orphanage that everyone looked after. Then there was a day when it went missing, and the caretakers found the cat's body parts stuffed under Logan Reed's bed. None of us had to look after any animal again. Soon the orphanage was filled with social workers that came to check up on him. The only response to their questions was a wicked smile that seemed to never leave Logan Reed's face throughout the interviews. Then there was the night fight between 2 boys in their rooms. Norman Porter was there, standing upright, wide awake, staring at the 2 children who punched and wrestled each other. The caretakers were enraged because one of the boys had a broken nose and it was an uncommon situation. But for us, we couldn't help but understand why he was there. Norman Porter was a very quiet person who rarely spoke to anyone but more or less himself. The confining feeling that each of us felt soon vanished after they left. I would always sigh a relief every morning I woke up. However, if I ever saw myself walking down the hallways where there isn't a child in sight or lying in bed hoping my eyes would drift off, I could not shake the feeling like I was being watched all the time. Although the heavy weight lifted itself off me, I always knew that I was not entirely alone. Months passed by until they returned back. I remember the look on every child's face when they stood at the doorway holding their belongings and walking silently to their rooms on our floor. I trembled in anger and most of all fear. Each family privately talked to Mrs. Powell before they left. Then we were brought down into the dining room again. Everyone's focus on the new families that wanted to take on board the freaks. It had only been 3 months of hell with them before they got adopted. The smaller children became less energetic, stopped playing with their toys or chasing each other in the halls. Instead, there would be nights where I found myself listening to screams of despair and constant cries in their beds, yelling at the caretakers that Jackson keeps on standing over them. Another incident where a boy named Caden swore he could hear whispering coming from the bathroom. When he looked, he found 7-year-old Daria facing the mirror, pale-faced, repeating words he couldn't fully understand. When me and Roman questioned him the other day what the first letter of what Daria might have said, he coldly replied, "It wasn't English." The orphanage became uncomfortable to live in. I've never experienced such abnormal behavior from any child, but all these circumstances might have proved it wrong. The younger children slamming their heads on the walls, 10-year-old boys wetting their beds even after claiming that they haven't peed their beds since they were 5. No one seemed to chat with one another. Breakfast, lunch, dinner was silent. Too silent. There was one night where I was in the dining room with no memory of walking there. Melinda found me. "You were chanting some weird things, Val. I have it on record." She handed me her phone during free time, and she was right. I was just standing in the dark, groaning words that I never knew. I don't get it. Ever since they left, all this creepy shit keeps happening. You think this is what happens after we get a dop? Dysphoria transfixed my body in place, consuming every inch of movement with a sickly, cold grasp. I couldn't move. The blood-curdling scream echoed the dead walls of the orphanage. It sounded as if it was multiple children at once, but my brain was a blur, desperately wondering if it was even human at all. I remember feeling my body slip out of the chair, footsteps thundering down as I made my way into the dining room, Melinda and Roman running with me. Everyone's focus remained on a little boy that stood in the middle of the hall, his jet-black hair in an upright posture, his head drawn right back and his eyes unfocused on the ceiling, as he coldly muttered words in a language we couldn't figure out. It all stopped when Mrs. Powell gave him the medicine, and he slowly fell into her arms as she demanded all of us to stop messing around or we won't be adopted. But that was a long time ago. For a while I always wondered where I belonged in this world. I believe all of us did. I am now in an interrogation room with many people watching me. Did you find the adopted children, Jackson H. Hills, Logan Reed, Inessa and Ileana Grove, Norman Porter? I trailed off. I am sorry, but there has been a misunderstanding. Those children were deceased long before. Ma'am, they were adopted, with a family, I pointed out as the lady in uniform shook her head. Whatever you experienced were caused by the drugging before bed and any time after that, which can cause difficulty to sleep or vivid hallucinations. The woman replied gently. I tried to hold in the tears that streamed down my cheeks. Now they were asking why I never searched for my family after years of being locked with children that had been missing for a while. The lady explained what the orphanage truly is, what the caretakers did, something that killed the remaining hope I had left. Sie behalten dich für immer here, the lady whispered. My ears pricked up. I frowned. They keep you here forever. One of the men with a thick accent translated. His face glimmered with a mixture of sadness. The absurd and strange behavior amongst the children were caused by something above our knowledge. I believe all of the children, including you, were haunted in the orphanage. Whatever caused the unnatural circumstances just saved your lives. The lady smiled. The weight, the paranoia, everything lifted off my chest completely. The adopted children we knew never returned, and every day I thank them for what they did. I just need to type this out. The playground was always old. When I was a kid, don't think I ever saw it in its prime. I'm not even sure if it ever had one. The paint on the old metal equipment was chipped, flaking off in uneven strips that revealed the deep rust beneath. The swings creaked in protest with each sway, and the merry-go-round groaned like an old man trying to stand up. And the aluminum slide was always hot in the summer, whether in the sun or not. Yet, as kids, we loved it. It was ours, tucked away at the edge of the woods where no adults ever came unless they were calling us home for dinner. It was the only place where we felt free from the pressures of school and our family life. Even now, the image of that place sits vividly in my mind. I can see the twisted bars of the jungle gym, the crooked ladder leading up to the slide, and the sandbox that always had more weeds than sand. It didn't matter. It never mattered. We made do as kids do. We ruled that tiny corner of the world, oblivious to its decay, its unkempt edges. But there was something about that playground I can't forget. A game we used to play, though none of us ever really understood it. It wasn't like tag or hide and seek. It felt more important, like there were rules we just knew, even if no one taught us. To this day, I only remember bits and pieces. A riddle we'd chant, strange steps we'd take, and the way we'd laugh, except thinking back, it didn't always sound like us. That laughter, it was off, like it came from somewhere else, sneaking into our game without permission. Only as an adult, when I see children play, it feels like a tickle in the back of my mind. My best friend Leah loved that game more than anyone. She was always the one who seemed to know the rules, even though she never told us how she learned them. She had this grin, a crooked, teasing thing that made you feel like you were part of a secret, even if you didn't understand it. I'd watch her as she started the game, her voice clear and confident as she called out the rhyme. The words were strange, like a song you hum but don't really know, yet when Leah said them, they felt like magic. Leah and I had been together for as long as I could remember. She was the kind of person who made everything fun, who turned the simplest things into adventures. I'd follow her anywhere, through the woods, onto the creaky merry-go-round, or up the jagged jungle gym. I didn't know why, but I always felt happiest when I was with her. Back then, I didn't understand the fluttery feeling I'd get when she laughed or looked my way. I just knew I liked being near her. And it wasn't just me. Everyone adored Leah. She was bold in a way that made us believe we could be too just by keeping up with her. Until one day, she wasn't there anymore. It happened on the playground. I remember that much, but the rest feels like trying to hold water in my hands. 1 minute, Leah was there, leading the game like she always did. Her ponytail swung back and forth as she laughed, her voice ringing out like it could chase away the shadows under the trees. She was on the merry-go-round, spinning so fast we all screamed at her to slow down. And then she was gone. I don't mean she ran off to hide or went home because her mom called her. She just wasn't there anymore. 1 second she was laughing, and the next, the merry-go-round was empty, still spinning, creaking louder than ever. We froze, staring at it like maybe she was just hiding behind the bars or crouched down where we couldn't see. But she wasn't. We called her name over and over, running all over the playground and even into the woods. "Leah, Leah, come on, stop messing around." I had shouted so loud my throat burned. None of us wanted to say it, but it felt like the playground had taken her, like it had sucked her up and hidden her somewhere we couldn't go. None of it made sense. It didn't feel real. I kept expecting her to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" And the longer we stood there, staring at the merry-go-round, the more it felt like something horrible had happened. We didn't understand it. How could we? We were just kids. All we knew was Leah was gone, and we couldn't find her. The neighbor kids that were playing had took off to get their parents, but I remember remaining. That meant I was the only one who heard the sound from deep within the woods. A strange groan like steel being bent or a musician dragging their bow across a cello's lower strings. A harsh, groaning sound. I ran. The police searched the woods for weeks, but they found nothing. Eventually, the town moved on, and so did I. At least, that's what I told myself. The sound and my friend were always in the back of my mind. I think about Leah more often than I care to admit. The way her laughter echoed through the trees, the flash of her sneakers as she climbed to the top of the jungle gym, the secretive glint in her eye when she spoke the words of that strange rhyme. She's still there, somewhere in the corners of my mind and the shadows of my memory. I can't let go of the feeling that I failed her, that I let her slip through my fingers when I should have held on tighter. Why am I telling you all this? Why am I writing my personal trauma on this website? I'm 34 now and I can't stop thinking about it. Lately, it has become even harder to put at the back of my mind. It's like a splinter, a sharp point that keeps poking no matter how much I try to ignore it. I tell myself that I'm letting work get to me, or the stress of having to work 2 jobs just to make things work. It began to get worse a week ago when I had with the same reoccurring dream. I was back at the playground, standing on the cracked asphalt that had once been a basketball court. The air smelled of rust and damp earth, the kind of smell that clings to old metal and forgotten places. In the dream, I heard the familiar creak of the swings, the groan of the merry-go-round and faint laughter, high-pitched, echoing as if it were coming from underwater. There was also that strange groan, but much louder than I had ever heard it before. It made my chest tighten, that sound. It was too distorted to be comforting and too familiar to be ignored. I woke up drenched in sweat, the laughter still ringing in my ears like a taunt. Every time I had that dream, it felt as if that sound was getting closer. I tried to make the dream stop. Doctor's prescription, self-medicated with weed, anything. Every night, I would wake up to that cursed place. Each time, the details became clearer, sharper, and closer. I started noticing things I hadn't as a child. The splintered wood of the slide, the warped metal of the monkey bars, the symbols scratched into the peeling paint. They were crude and jagged, shapes that seemed to shift and twist the longer I stared at them, as though the dream itself didn't want me to understand. I know I was lying to myself. I think it was 2 days ago I woke up in a cold sweat realizing the truth. Something was calling me back. I had somehow failed her, and I needed to go back and see what I could do to make it right, to stop that groan from getting her. It's not just about the playground anymore. It's about Leah, about what happened that day, about the pieces of myself I left behind with her. I didn't know if I'd find answers, but I couldn't keep pretending. I had to go back. I told myself it was just a visit to family, an excuse to see familiar faces and reconnect. So, one Friday after work, I gave in. I packed a small bag, just enough to make it look like a regular trip, and got in my car. The drive felt like both a return and a journey into something unfamiliar. The landmarks, old gas stations, crooked signs, and faded shops, passed by like ghostly memories, stirring up feelings I'd buried for years. The town was the same, yet different, as though it had somehow changed without me realizing it. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting the town in soft gold and orange hues. The evening light made everything look still. I spent time with family, catching up on small talk and listening to stories that no longer felt as familiar as they should. But even as I sat there, I could feel the pull. I knew where my thoughts kept wandering, even if I didn't speak it aloud. The playground wasn't far, and I could almost feel its presence, waiting patiently for me to come back. I sat across from my parents at the kitchen table, my fingers drumming nervously against the edge. The house smelled of garlic and rosemary, and the soft hum of my mom chopping vegetables filled the air. Dad was sitting at the window, sipping his iced tea, staring out into the yard. Everything about this moment should have felt comforting, like it always had when I was younger. "Hey, Mom, Dad," I began, my voice low and hesitant. "Do you remember the old playground, the one by the woods?" My mom paused mid-chop, glancing at Dad. "Oh, sure," she said, smiling as she wiped her hands on a towel. "That old place. You used to play there all the time with the other kids. What about it?" I shifted in my seat, trying to figure out how to bring this up. The words felt awkward, like they didn't quite belong in the air. "I don't know, I've just been thinking about it lately," I muttered, unable to keep the unease out of my voice. Dad chuckled from the window, not looking at me. "That place? Good grief, it was falling apart even when you were a kid. I remember when they took down the slide. It was so rusted they thought someone might get hurt." "Yeah," I said, my eyes glued to my hands in my lap. "But do you remember how the older kids used to tell stories about it? Weird stories?" Mom raised an eyebrow, still focused on chopping. "Stories?" "Well, there were always rumors, especially around Halloween. I think some kids thought it was haunted or something." She shrugged as if it were just another silly tale. "We always told you to stay away from that place after dark." I couldn't help myself. "What kind of stories?" "I don't remember any." I pushed, my heart pounding in my chest, hoping they'd say something. Anything that might make sense of the creeping dread that had settled over me. Dad looked over at me with a smile, like he was about to tell me something funny. "Oh, you know how kids are, ghost stories. Some said the playground was built on cursed land, or that the swings would move on their own. The usual stuff. But honestly, I think it was just a way for the older kids to scare the younger ones so they could smoke and hook up." I wanted to argue, to tell them that it wasn't just a silly story. But as I looked at them, I realized they had no idea. No idea at all. To them, it was all just an old memory, something harmless and forgotten. I was the only one who remembered, really remembered. Did they even remember Leah? Dad chuckled and took another sip of tea. "They used to say things like that about all sorts of places when we were kids. It's just a way to make the place seem more exciting, more dangerous. It's a playground, for crying out loud. There's nothing to it." "Yeah," I lied. "I guess you're right." But even as they went back to talking about dinner, I could feel the weight of their words pressing on me. It was all so casual to them, like the playground was nothing more than a relic of childhood. As I sat there listening to them, the quiet seemed to press in even harder. I wanted to ask them more, to see if they knew anything else, but I couldn't bring myself to. They didn't understand. They hadn't seen what I had seen. And for the first time in a long time, I wondered if they ever would. After dinner, I told them I was going to drive around and check out the old places I used to hang out. They happily told me to have fun and suggested a few places like where the Blockbuster used to be or the skating rink. I had only one destination in mind. The playground was still there, though it looked far worse than I remembered. The swings hung limply from rusted chains, their seats split and sagging. The merry-go-round had tilted to one side, its base half buried in the ground like the earth had tried to reclaim it. The slide was nothing more than a skeletal frame now, its jagged edges jutting out like broken bones. The sandbox had been almost completely devoured by weeds, their spindly stalks reaching up past my knees. Even the jungle gym, once a centerpiece of our games, was nothing but a twisted ruin of metal. The air was heavy, thick with a stillness that felt unnatural. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, making you hyper-aware of every tiny sound. My own footsteps on the cracked asphalt felt too loud, as if they were intruding on something sacred, or something forbidden. A shiver ran through me, sharp and cold, the kind that crawls down your spine when you know you shouldn't be somewhere but can't bring yourself to leave. I stood there for a long time, staring at the remains of the place that had once been ours. The memories came rushing back. Leah's laugh, the strange game we used to play, and the way the shadows always seemed to stretch a little too far here, even in the middle of the day. It all felt so wrong now, like the playground had been waiting for me to return. I clenched my fists, willing myself to move, to turn back toward the car and forget this place forever. But I couldn't. Not yet. Something was here, something was waiting, and deep down I knew I wouldn't leave until I found it. The wind kicked up, swirling leaves and dust around my feet as I stepped toward the swings. The last day I saw Leah playing through my mind. The cold wind gusted around me and the swings moved in a slow, rhythmic sway, creaking in protest as if they carried invisible riders. The sound grated on my nerves, each groan dragging me deeper into a memory I wished I could forget. I hesitated before sitting down, the cold metal chains biting into my palms. As soon as I settled, a rush of déjà vu slammed into me, stealing my breath. I gripped the chains tighter, trying to steady myself, but it was no use. The sensation was overwhelming, like being caught in the pull of a tide, dragged into something far older than me. I remembered this, sitting here, the swings rocking gently, the faint sound of laughter, high-pitched, distorted and wrong, floating on the breeze. It was laughter I didn't want to hear again, and then I did. Ethan. The voices were faint at first, a lilting whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My name, spoken in those sing-song tones, sent a chill down my spine. Ethan. The sound grew louder, closer, yet I saw nothing. The playground was empty, a ruin of rust and decay. Leah, I said hoarsely, my voice sounding as if it had forgotten how to speak. There was no response. The moon had started to crest the trees, and its silver glow illuminating the cursed place I sat. My eyes began to roam around, senses heightened as if I was getting ready to fight. On the slide, where faded graffiti had once scrawled vulgarities and crude drawings, new symbols emerged. They weren't painted. They grew from the metal itself, glowing faintly in the dimming light. Their jagged edges shifted as if alive, forming words that sent my stomach plummeting. To leave this place, you must win the game. But play it wrong, and here you'll remain. The game. The words blurred as I stared at them, pulsing in rhythm with the rapid thud of my heartbeat. And then, like a door cracking open, the memories came flooding back. The rules, the steps, the twisted ritual we had followed so blindly as children, not understanding its weight. It was as if my adult brain could comprehend what I could not as a child. This was no simple fun thing, but something twisted and evil. The game. How was the game played? I could hear Leah's voice clearly in my mind, her excitement practically bubbling over. Okay, Ethan, listen closely, she would say, always eager to begin. We have to say the words or it doesn't start. It's the rules, and the rules are everything. I remembered how she'd lead us, the words spilling from her lips like a chant we were all supposed to know by heart. Round and round we spin and fall. The shadows call, the game begins. The memory hit me like a wave, and suddenly I was back there, standing before the merry-go-round. The once vibrant colors had dulled to a sickly rust, the paint chipped away by years of neglect. I heard the chant again, Leah's voice in my head, but it wasn't the words that startled me. It was the way they felt. The words were like a key turning in a lock. As soon as the chant filled my mind, the playground seemed to wake. The air around the merry-go-round thickened, pressing in on me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I didn't have time to think. Before I knew it, I was standing on the platform, my feet unsteady, and I could hear the soft echo of children's laughter in the distance. It was faint, but it wasn't just any laughter. It was wrong. It sounded too high-pitched, too sharp, like it was coming from underwater, or maybe from somewhere far darker. Even though everything felt foggy, I knew that I had to play the game. If there was any chance of me going home, I had to play. Don't touch it, Leah's voice whispered, her excitement building. Not yet. Just wait for it to start. Hold on tight and don't let go. I was alone, but I knew I wasn't. In the deepest distance, I could hear that groan that haunted me as a child. Terror gripped me as the playground seemed to shift in the moonlight. I wanted to run, but then I heard it. The voice was soft. It could have been in my head, but it broke through the fog. "Don't leave me again, Ethan." I stepped forward, placing my foot on the merry-go-round, and instantly, it groaned beneath me, the sound low and ominous, like the groan of something ancient. I wasn't sure if it was the weight of the chant or the pull of something deeper, but I felt it. Round and round we spin and fall. The shadows call, the game begins. I chanted as assured as I could. The merry-go-round started moving, slowly at first, just a hint of motion beneath my feet. How it could even do that was a mystery to me. It should have broken off its pivot, but there was a perceptible tug on it. Then, with a lurch, it began to spin. It began to move, and I leaned forward to keep my balance. I wasn't supposed to touch it yet. I knew that much. The merry-go-round spun with a force I couldn't comprehend, pulling me into its dizzying spiral. I should have been thrown off, but the laws of physics failed to work. I felt myself being pulled to the center of the children's play toy. The ground beneath it seemed to dissolve, replaced by a swirling void that looked like it could swallow everything whole. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew it was time, so I clung to one of the bars, the metal cold and slick in my grip, as the force of the spin tried to pull me into the center. I crouched and hung on for dear life. The chant echoed in my head again, louder now, weaving its way into my thoughts like an unstoppable force. Round and round we spin and fall. The shadows call, the game begins. The words seemed to reach out, clawing at me, making the air grow colder and heavier. The darkness below me felt endless, like I could fall forever. The laughter, the wrong, shrill laughter, swirled around me, a chorus of voices calling my name, calling me to join them. I gritted my teeth, refusing to let go, my hands slick with sweat as I held on. The spin continued faster, until I thought my arms would snap from the strain. And then just as quickly as it started, it slowed. The world came back into focus, the void beneath me faded away, and the merry-go-round finally came to a stop, leaving me breathless and shaken, heart still pounding in my chest. But the words, the chant, lingered. It was like they were still hanging in the air around me, waiting for the next step. I did not realize I had my eyes until I heard her voice. Hearing it again brought tears to my eyes, and I opened them. "Ethan." I looked around and could not see her, but I knew I heard her voice. The cracked asphalt looked like it had been pulled from the very bowels of the earth, the fissures oozing something dark and thick like tar or blood, which stained the edges of the playground. The stench was suffocating, a rancid blend of decay and rot that made my stomach twist. I stumbled off, gasping for air, but there was no time to recover. Instinct dragging me toward the sandbox, dragging me deeper into this grotesque nightmare. The sandbox had long been overtaken, the weeds now thick and gnarly, their twisted stalks curling like blackened fingers, reaching for me. But beneath the weeds, the sand still shifted, though not like it should. It moved unnaturally, as if something beneath it was alive, waiting, pulling the grains toward a hidden abyss. My feet sank into the sand as I stepped forward, the ground giving way like the soft belly of a rotting corpse. My hands trembled as I dropped to my knees and dug, the sand shifting around my fingers in sickening waves. And then I felt them, cold and brittle. Bones, small, fragile bones. I dug harder, the sound of cracking bones sickening, until I uncovered them fully. They weren't just bones, they were wrong. Fragile and delicate, but they didn't feel like they belonged to any living thing. The moment my fingers touched them, they crumbled to dust, blackened ash sticking to my skin like burnt remnants of something long forgotten. My breath caught in my throat as I scrambled back, heart racing, but the sand didn't stop. It shifted again, curling and writhing, and as if in response, words began to form. The shadows watch, they'll take their due, finish the game, or they'll take you too. The words burned into me, the very air around me turning cold as if the temperature itself had dropped 100 degrees. I looked up, chest heaving, and froze. The shadows, they stretched unnaturally long, too long, reaching across the ground like claws scraping at the earth. Their edges curled like smoke, flickering in and out of focus. But they weren't just shadows anymore. They were figures. Children, but not the kind of children I remember. Their eyes were hollow, like empty sockets filled with darkness. Their limbs were twisted, bent at impossible angles, flickering like old film, jerky and uneven. They didn't move closer, but I could feel them, feel their eyes burning into me. They were unblinking. They were hungry. The air thickened with their silent watching, the suffocating pressure of their gaze, as if they were waiting for something. That groan, that damn groan echoed so close to me that it caused me to tremble uncontrollably. I knew deep down that they weren't just shadows, they were them. The children who had been lost, the ones who hadn't gone home, they had never left. Leah's form flickered into view, not like how I remembered her, bright and full of life, but hazy, like a dream I could barely grasp. Her voice came to me, soft and uncertain, like a child trying to explain something too big for their small world. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling in the air around me. I didn't know. I thought we were playing." She hesitated, her figure twisting in the air, the edges of her fading in and out like she wasn't sure how to hold herself together. But it wasn't just a game, was it? I felt her confusion, her pain swirling in the air like a cold wind. She sounded like the Leah I knew, but there was something off about the way she spoke now, like she was trying to put together pieces of a puzzle she didn't quite understand herself. "I played the game by myself," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and I could hear the sorrow in her tone. "I wasn't supposed to. It told me not to, but I did it anyway. I was supposed to play with you, but I wanted to play alone." Leah's trailed off, and I could feel her fear, raw and unfiltered, like the first time she realized what was happening. "It took me, Ethan. It took me, and I didn't know." I took a step back, trying to process what she was saying, but it didn't make sense. She sounded so young, so lost, like a child trying to understand a story that was too big for her. "What now?" I asked her, my voice breaking, looking at the little girl I once loved as a child. "You must play the game, Ethan. You must. The game has to be finished." Her form flickered again. "I've been waiting for you to come back, so we can finish it." Her words rushed out, a mix of desperation and childlike hope, like she didn't fully understand what she was asking me to do, but it was all she had left. I wanted to scream, to tell her it wasn't possible, that she was gone and trapped in this place. But the words stuck in my throat, and I could feel her eyes on me, wide and pleading, like a child who didn't realize the full weight of what she was asking. "Please, Ethan." Her voice was so small now, barely a whisper. "You have to come back and finish it. We have to finish the game. We have to finish before you also break the rules." Her figure trembled and flickered once more, her eyes wide with an innocence that twisted into something darker, something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just a game, it was something far worse. "I played it wrong, Ethan, but you can still win." The ground beneath me seemed to tremble as her words echoed in my mind. I didn't want to play this game with her, not like this. But I could feel her, waiting, wanting, urging me towards something I couldn't quite understand. And somewhere deep inside, I knew I had no choice. The game wasn't over, it was only waiting for me to return. I felt the weight of Leah's gaze pressing into me, her flickering form trembling in the air around me. "I'm grown up now, and I'll take care of you just like I promised back then." Her small hand, so cold, so light, rested gently in my hand, and she smiled, but it was not the smile I remembered. It was something different, something hollow and sad. Her voice came soft, almost as if she were speaking through a veil of grief. "You can't," she said, her words curling around me like smoke. "I broke the rules a long time ago, Ethan. I told you. I was the one who played alone, and now I belong to it." I felt the air grow colder around me, a pressure building in my chest. A sudden weight seemed to settle on my heart, pulling me down. "No," I murmured, shaking my head desperately. "That's not true. I can still save you. I can get you out of here. We'll go back. You'll be safe. We'll go home." But Leah's expression softened, and she shook her head, her eyes glistening with something that could have been sorrow, or something far darker, something ancient. "It's already too late, Ethan," she said gently, as though explaining something that was far beyond my understanding. "It's already taken me. It's been so long, and I've been waiting for you, just seeing you again before I fade completely." I felt something twist inside me, an aching knot of grief, of helplessness. She had been waiting for me. She had been alone all this time, trapped in this place where the game never ended, where the rules were twisted, perverted by something ancient and hungry. It had aged her in ways I hadn't expected. I looked up then, instinctively drawn to the edge of the woods, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the trees, just out of reach of the light, there was something impossibly large, stretching beyond comprehension. It was a shadow, or perhaps many shadows, writhing together, indistinguishable from one another, but each one moving in ways that defied the laws of nature. The shape of it was grotesque, an endless mass of limbs and whispers, groaning, the sound that had haunted my childhood, echoing through the air like 1,000 suffering souls. I staggered back, my chest tightening with terror. "That," I whispered, voice trembling, "that's what took you. It's still here. I can't leave you to it, Leah." Leah's form flickered harder as if she was beginning to fade completely. Her voice seemed to come from all around me, like a breeze whispering through the leaves. "You can't save me, Ethan. I'm already lost to it. It's too late. But you..." She trailed off, a warmth spreading across her face, a moment of peace. "I saved you." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Every part of me wanted to run, to save her, to drag her away from this nightmare. But as I looked at her, really looked at her, I saw the truth in her eyes. She was right. The shadows at the edge of the woods shifted again, and I felt them pull at me, pulling me toward the darkness like a magnet of dread. My chest tightened, and I knew I couldn't stay here, not any longer. But I didn't want to leave her. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'll find a way. I'll fix this." Leah's smile softened, and I could swear I saw a tear shimmer in her eye, though it vanished as quickly as it came. "Thank you, Ethan," she murmured, almost too softly to hear. "But it's enough. Just knowing you're here, just knowing you care. I can let go now." And then, as if she had never been there at all, Leah faded into the air, leaving only the hollow, lingering feeling of loss and sorrow in her place. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where she had been. The weight of the shadows pressed on me, and I could hear the groaning grow louder, the monstrous thing waiting just out of sight. I turned, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I couldn't save her, couldn't undo what had been done. But I could still try to escape, I could still try to survive. The shadows pressed in around me, suffocating in their weight, but something stirred in my mind, like a flicker of light in a dark room. I remembered the rhyme. Leah's voice echoed in my head, soft and unyielding, despite the horrors surrounding me. "To escape, you must go down where they once slid, through the hollow, the dark, where the others hid. The slide. It had always been there, towering in the corner of the playground, a darkened tunnel of metal that twisted into the unknown. I had never thought to go down it before, never dared to. But now the rhyme had given me a path, a way out. At least that's what I told myself. My heart pounded as I turned toward the slide, the one place I had always avoided. The dark hole at the top seemed to leer at me, waiting, promising nothing good. It was different now. The slide wasn't just an object, it was a doorway, a gateway into something unspeakable. And it was calling me. I took a step toward it, the air around me heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The slide groaned under the weight of the past, as if it had been waiting for me all this time. Each step felt like it was pulling me deeper into the nightmare, but I couldn't stop. The rhyme played over and over in my mind, like a chant that forced my legs to move. I climbed the ladder slowly, my hands slick with sweat, the metal cold under my fingertips. The laughter, distorted and far away, echoed in the distance. It wasn't the children's laughter anymore. It was something else, something hungry. Reaching the top, I hesitated. The opening at the top of the slide was black, as if it led straight into the void. I could feel the darkness pressing against me, just out of sight, like 1,000 eyes watching. It took everything in me to push forward, to crouch and lower myself into the dark tunnel. The instant I began to slide, the world changed. The air became thick like molasses, dragging me downward, the sensation so wrong that I felt my insides twist with panic. The slide was too tight, too narrow, the walls closing in on me. It didn't feel like metal beneath me. It felt like something alive, slick and writhing, pulling me deeper, faster until I could barely breathe. And then the sound started, whispers, low guttural murmurs that echoed inside the slide. Voices, children's voices, Leah's voice. They weren't calling to me, though. They were calling for something else, something far worse, and it was too late for me to stop it now. I couldn't move. I was trapped in the slide, racing toward whatever waited at the end. My heart hammered, my chest tight, but I couldn't scream. My mouth was dry, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The slide jerked suddenly, and I thought for a moment that I would be ripped apart, that I would be crushed in the dark. But then, just as quickly as it began, it stopped. The world around me had shifted. It was the same, but different. The air was still heavy, but there was a faint light now, a glow that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was as if I had crossed some threshold, some boundary between what was real and what was not. The light that filtered through the trees was soft at first, a faint glow creeping into the corners of the world. It felt like a new day was beginning, but I knew better. It wasn't the start of anything. The sun's rise didn't erase what had happened. The warmth on my skin felt foreign, like a reminder that the world had moved on without me, while I was still trapped in the echo of that game. I stood there, staring out into the quiet woods. The shadows had receded, but their presence lingered, like a weight pressing against my chest. Leah's voice, her laughter, the rhyme, it all felt so distant now, like a fading dream I couldn't remember clearly. Her fate was sealed, and I couldn't save her. I hadn't been able to save her when it had mattered, and I wouldn't be able to save her now. The truth of it was worse than the unanswered questions. The not knowing had always gnawed at me like an itch I couldn't scratch, but to face the truth, that she was lost to that place, bound to something ancient and hungry, was a kind of pain I couldn't escape. I thought I might feel relief, as if the horror were behind me, but I didn't. I felt empty. The sun continued its slow climb, casting golden light on the twisted trunks of trees, on the damp earth where the shadows had once stretched so long and so dark. The world around me was peaceful now, but I knew it wasn't real peace. It was a fragile kind of calm, like the stillness after a storm before the next one hits. And the worst part? I knew deep down that I would never be free of it. Not really. There was no going back to the way things were before. The game wasn't over. It had only moved on, waiting for the next player. I just hoped it would be a long time before someone else had to take my place. It was a Thursday when God revealed himself to all of humanity. The day started ordinary enough, but sometime in the afternoon I felt a presence in my chest and a voice in my ear. "I have returned," the voice said. As it just so happened that everyone had heard that voice, everyone felt that presence. And soon everyone stepped out of their dwellings and looked up at the sky and saw the clouds disappear and a brilliant light shine for just an instant, a moment. A light so brilliant it couldn't have belonged to the sun, and it had to have been something else. And it was clear. The feeling in our hearts was certain. The Lord was real, and he was here. What happened next was likely what you would have expected. The world became kinder, more compassionate, not by virtue of an intrinsic force of goodness overtaking us, but rather the fear of retribution. You didn't want to fight, didn't want to insult, didn't want to judge, because you didn't know what would happen when you did. A safe life with the recent supernatural developments was one that contained a bit more charity, a bit more turning the other cheek, and a bit more feigned grace. Fake it till you make it, after all. I watched for signs of what would change next. We were all under the watchful eye, but it at least felt, incorrectly we would realize, that the Almighty's interventions had been minimal so far. Everyone found out at their own pace that death had become a thing of the past. Some knew immediately, when their loved ones in hospice care saw remarkable turnarounds in health. Others missed the memo until mass consensus had been established, when scientists and statisticians alike revealed that by every known metric, natural disasters, car crashes, heart attacks, that the number of daily reported deaths had plummeted from an average of 160,000 to zero. Life went on, and as it did, I started hearing whispers of what worship was. Depending on who you talked to, online or at the water cooler, you'd hear a different rumor, a different interpretation. It wasn't until my mom was called upon that I knew what it was. I remember it vividly. 7 o'clock after dinner, Mom got up from her seat in the living room, got ready, donned her coat, stepped towards the shoe rack. "Where you heading, hon?" my father asked her. "I've been summoned." "I'm sorry?" "The Lord has summoned me for worship." I remember just how odd the moment felt. Life had been tinged with a certain unreality since the grand question was blown wide open. Seeing Mom head for the door both did and didn't make any sense. Had it been any other year, we would have thought she was doing a bit. "Did you, need a ride?" my dad asked confusedly. The Lord would like me to walk, she responded. Then she turned the knob and went outside. I was 17 at the time, my brother was 20. We both asked Dad if we should follow her. He told us to stay home, that he'd accompany her and figure out what was going on. He didn't return until the next evening. We rushed downstairs when we heard the front door open, hoping we'd catch both parents entering. Instead, it was just him, disheveled, weary, a muted expression on his face. I'll never forget the way he looked at us. She's standing in a field, he said. Then, there are other people there too. 4 months passed since Mom was first called to worship. During that time, we learned something more about God's interventions. The new commandments, as I'd termed them in my brain, were panning out as the following. Thou shalt not die, via disease, natural disasters, etc. Thou shalt be called to worship at a random time. Now I'll admit neither of those are as catchy as the OG commandments. This is, after all, not the official word of the Lord, merely just my reading of the tea leaves. Commandment 3 came to me in a dream. Kidding, it came to me in a YouTube video. It was your usual street fight video. 2 guys on a sidewalk corner, for reasons unknown, exchanging blows, until the bigger of the 2 got the upper hand and started wailing and wailing, then secured a knife and, like a light bulb went off in his head, stopped, lifted himself from his rival. The guy getting his ass handed to him stood up also, and then both of them just walked. Single file, empty expressions on their faces. Manchurian candidate shit. So, if thou attempt to kill another, thou shalt immediately be summoned to worship, was the takeaway. But what, pray tell, was worship really? I visited my mom one afternoon to understand better. The spot she had journeyed to was an hour's drive from home, so she must have trekked for hours that first night. I arrived at the field to the sight of thousands of people standing evenly spaced, 3 feet apart in every direction. They all faced the same way, heads tilted slightly towards the sky, perfectly still, no movement. I maneuvered the rows for what felt like an endless amount of time. When I finally found her, it genuinely felt like I just got lucky. It was my first time seeing her since she'd been gone. I had mentally convinced myself that there was no need for me to come out here. After all, she'd be coming home, any day now. Mom, I'll admit I was a bit emotional. To my surprise, despite her fixed posture and eyes tilted up, her mouth moved. Hi, sweetheart. How are you? I'm well, I am in worship. She wasn't totally being herself. Mom, are you able to move? I am in worship, she repeated. But do you want to come home? The softness in her tone didn't change, but it did seem like she was imbuing her words with some kind of subtext, trying to say something more. I can't, love. And then, enunciated even clearer, I think you should go home. Perhaps before you're forced to stay too, but home, get going now, dear. I told her I loved her, then departed through the gathering of worshippers, all of them laid out so absolutely perfectly, like a chessboard. Everyone had their spot. And there was plenty of land to go. So much so that I had to wonder what spots myself, my friends, dad, older brother, and everyone I'd ever loved would potentially occupy one day. En route, I spotted a few other visitors. They looked more morose than I was. They whispered words of affirmation and love to their respective persons, hearing responses sure, but said responses from the corner of their loved ones' mouths seeming light, quiet, curt, God-centric. Like they were standing at someone's gravesite, albeit more a statue than a grave. A commemoration of someone long gone. But no one was really gone. Mom hadn't left. Worship would be over soon, it had to be. Maybe another couple of weeks, couple months at most, and then she'd be home, and the Lord would call someone else to take her place. When thou art in worship, thou shalt not age. Commandment 4 became common knowledge a year later. The amount of folks called to worship had steadily gone up during this time. This was global, of course, so anyone curious could at any time look up a live stream of the designated worship areas around the world to see people standing uniformly, frozen, perfectly spaced in parks, beaches, city squares, you name it. Every town, every city had its place. My place, I supposed, would be the same field where Mom was, unless it filled up by the time it was my turn. In which case, it could very well have been somewhere completely random and unknown. The no-aging revelation was again something discerned by the ever-decreasing amount of practicing scientists on the planet. Outside of worship, life was still progressing normally, more or less, except for that final, tricky death step. Worship grief was a real term now, the experience of losing someone to God, essentially. Not yet coined was the secret counterpart buried in all our brains that God knows. Literally, we weren't brave enough to speak. Worship fear. I tried my best to keep my thoughts pure. I couldn't help but assume that thoughts of blasphemy contained within the 17 or so centimeters of my brain were fair game for our omnipotent ruler to scrutinize. It was a nice fantasy, though, the idea that there might be a spot, a street corner without God's CCTV camera. Somewhere you could just be you without fear that your insubordination would expedite the ticket to your special place on God's canvas. Support groups existed, and so I joined one, and that's where the no-aging element of worship was first pitched to me as one of the many pros of the whole construction. I didn't find Commandment 4 comforting, but I smiled and nodded nonetheless. The world was still the world, but less so. I'd take the train to work and notice that the average of people's expressions had gone from tired and cranky to subtly mortified. I once saw a woman break down and start crying, and I can almost swear she said under her breath, "I don't want to go." Or maybe I was just projecting. Nightmares weren't the same anymore. The worst dream I could have now wasn't one where I was being chased by a murderer or caught in a storm. Rather, the one where I would stop in place while I was doing something mundane. I would hear a voice in my head. The voice would say, "You have been summoned." My feet would start walking on their own, and I'd know exactly where I was going, even if I didn't know where it was. I'd jolt awake in my bed, sweating, praying, funny as it were, that I still had executive function. That, and the little moments where I'd feel a random twitch or spasm in my leg, those were the killers. And then 4 years passed, and it must have been close to 30% of the global population then in worship. My dad an unfortunate addition to that communion. My brother and I never got a chance to see him exit stage left into the crowd. The day that he was called upon, he was out and about. I believe he'd gone to see the mechanic, and maybe had a physio appointment on the docket afterwards too. That didn't matter now. We held out hope until the third day of him being gone. The field where Mom stood was full now, and at this point our city had quite a few landmarks for congregation. My brother and I took turns visiting these different areas to see if we could maybe catch our dad standing amongst the crowd. No luck. Around then I started coming around to what the fifth commandment might have been. Again, this was just me spitballing, but getting any sense of rules or structure during this time was oddly a place of comfort. It was nice to know what, if any, parameters there were to this. It was a redundant rule, really, as I'm sure you'll understand once I spell it out clearly. The thought came to me when I'd see people standing atop high-rises right close to the edge as if they were about to leap. And then they'd just turn around. Or when I'd spot people on the bridge walking alongside the cars, albeit robotically. And I'd wonder if I was just being a cynic, or if maybe some of the pedestrians strolling alongside traffic had originally arrived with ulterior motives. With my brother's mistake, it all became clear. I walked into his room one day to catch him sitting at his desk, a gun pressed to his temple, his hand trembling, the barrel shaking, finger resting on the trigger. I froze in place, and I'll admit I had the following thought. Please, please, God, let the bullet pass through his skull. Let him die. Instead, the gun fell to the ground. His hand ceased quaking. He stood up from his chair, walked to his closet, grabbed his coat, put it on. "Marcus," I asked. "Just gonna head out," he said. "To worship," he said, matter-of-factly. "I've been called upon." He headed for the front door. I trailed. "Marcus," I said again. He ignored me. "I don't listen. I'm only asking out of curiosity." I tried not to sign my own release form with my words. "Are you able to control your body at all, even a little bit?" "No, and I am going to worship." "You can't even. If you were feeling the call, it would be clear to you too, and now I need to go." He grabbed his shoes. I walked him the whole way there, 5 hours, until he took his spot in the cleared-out parking lot of a now-defunct amusement park, alongside thousands of men, women, and children. He didn't say anything to me on the trek there, though to be fair, I didn't say much to him either. "If thou attempt to take thine own life, you guessed it, thou shalt immediately be summoned to worship." Gallows humor. The world coped with gallows humor. 70% of the world, after all, give or take, was in the worship state now. I tried my best not to think about it. Standing still, head turned towards the sky, body frozen for weeks, months, or in the case of my mom and dad, years on end. It was selfish, but I would struggle to visit my mother. When I did go, it would be for a quick side hug, a quick, I love you, and then a hasty exit. I would always wish that she were in a deep trance state, too out of it to return the greeting, but she was instead consistently lucid. "Love you too, sweetheart," she'd say, way too presently. It made me uncomfortable, to be that awake, that aware of what was going on. I didn't like it. The headcanon I was trying to run with was that worship would be a blissful, effortless, dreamlike state. All of the evidence was to the contrary. To God's credit, it seemed like we could talk about worship fear quite openly. Certainly all of the support groups, online communities and such were reflecting a different, more honest state for man. YouTube videos and TikTok clips talking about a surefire way to escape. Tactics to reality shift out of this timeline to another. Deep states of meditation that would allow you to pass peacefully without being summoned to one of God's many gathering grounds. And of course, all too many video essays scrutinizing the Lord, complaining about the state of things, calling for revolution, madness really. There were two moments that stuck with me, moments that really captured the spirit of things. The first was the final video of that guy who was planning an elaborate, Rube Goldberg-esque escape from his physical body. Doused himself and his room in gasoline, held a string tied to a blade suspended above his head, had a timer with an explosion counting down. I commended the hell out of his effort. The moment hit, he tossed a match from his seat to the corner. Flames ignited, he pulled the string, and then the fire fizzled as soon as it reached him. The blade froze in midair. The explosion never happened, thank goodness really, as the camera footage eventually discovered and uploaded was gold. And then our friend got up from his seat, still dripping and flammable, and walked out of frame. Commandment 5, my friend. Commandment 5. The other was the video of that big streamer who kept faking that he'd been summoned while live on Twitch. His face would go blank, he'd get up from his seat, and he'd mechanically step out of his room. He'd done the fake out so many times that when it was the real thing, chat was in denial for hours. Hilariously horrifying. People still worked, still clung to routine, but it was pretty fruitless. I'd see street preachers with a megaphone telling us that our time was soon, like, no shit, my guy. Apple, despite most of their workforce having clocked out permanently, still managed to come out with new products somehow. Streaming was mainly reruns, however. Probably hard to commit to a full season of material when your director, lead actor, lead writer, and everyone else on set could step out at a moment's notice and never come back. Less workers everywhere you went, but hey, it made sense. Less customers and all. I picked up a coffee from the Starbucks in my area that still had employees and went off to see my brother. It'd been 2 years. His was the hardest one for me. After all, I knew deep down he wouldn't have wanted me to pity him, but holy shit did I. I returned to the parking lot. It was much busier with people now, at capacity it seemed. I maneuvered the gaps and finally got to him. "Hey," I said. "Hi," he said. "How is it?" I saw his chest expand and contract with his steady breaths. Head lifted, eyes angled up. "How is it?" I asked again. "I'm in worship," he said. "And it'll probably be my time soon too," I said. "Help me prepare." Again he said nothing. "Bro," I said. It took him a while to finally speak. "You know," he said, "the thought I think about the most is that some random bullet could be flying around somehow. Just a random bullet fired from hundreds of miles away, and it gets past God's radar, and it catches me in the back of the head, and it all goes black for me. It's my favorite thought. It's the dream that's keeping me going." I didn't say anything. I couldn't say anything. There's a feeling in my chest, a sureness. This isn't going to stop. I felt trapped. It's going to go on for eternity. No heat death, just this. I put my hand on his shoulder. An empty gesture, really. I think I just needed something to help keep me upright. "Please find a way to kill me," he said. And then I had to go. I think I heard him say, "Please stay, I need conversation." Or maybe I imagined it. Or maybe I heard it bang on clear, but I didn't want to think about it because it made me feel like shit. Survivorship bias is a really strange feeling to have when you're still on the sinking Titanic. Sure, your section of the ship isn't submerged yet, but you would be there soon enough with Leo and the gang. Whoever was keeping track had stopped counting. Almost everyone was gone. It was dumb luck, pure and simple. Dumb luck that I hadn't been called upon yet. My soft research started the moment Dad disappeared, but you can be damn sure it escalated after the conversation with my brother. I approached everything with an open mind and tried anything I could. Specific meditations, incantations, prayers to the Lord for the global worship session to end. I went to specific coordinates in towns where rumor had it people could actually die. My trips were immeasurably disappointing. No death to be found anywhere. The old constants, death and taxes. The new constants, immortality and worship. I was en route to my 80th or so desperate attempt to find salvation. See Annihilation. A picture of a flyer that was shared to one of the many holy shit we need to die ASAP groups I was a part of detailed the church that one Reverend Lucien Ferrer was practicing at. He made lofty promises about his support group that I was sure he wouldn't be able to deliver on. The bottom of the flyer reading much like a pyramid scheme. Join a community with a surefire solution to worship fear. No testimonials because we have a 100% success rate. Come and see the miracle for yourself. But desperate times and all that nonsense. I made the 4-hour drive on the way spotting some of the many new landmarks of people gathered, perfectly spaced apart, facing the same direction, heads slanted upwards, locked in perpetual admiration for the Lord. It felt like my time was closing in. Like I'd stop the car any moment now, step out, walk along the side of the road until I reached my place. I arrived at the destination. The church looked desolate from the outside, looked long abandoned. No clue what Reverend Lucien was running here, but hey, if it was just a prank, he got me. I stepped inside and then I felt it. The lack of the feeling of the Lord in my chest. It felt like my bond with the Creator had been severed. By the entrance there was a table with a sign-in form and a pen. I scribbled my name and the time. The interior stretched quite long. I took a seat in the pews. There were a few others seated in the rows. They looked like they'd been waiting for quite some time. After a little while, a man came out on the stage. "Just gonna be a couple more hours, but he should be seeing to all of you soon," he said. It felt like I was at the doctor's office for an appointment. He didn't reappear for quite some time as promised. Time stood still. I heard the tick, tick, tick of the clock, my hands on my legs. Don't move involuntarily. Don't move involuntarily. He came out, called someone else's name. Thomas Gilmore. Is Thomas Gilmore here? And sure enough, Thomas got up from his seat and followed the man to the back. Tick, tick, tick. Eve Merritt, Eve? That's me. Her hand shot up. That's me. And off she went to the back. Tick, tick, tick. I really, truly didn't know how much time I had left. "It just says Lily here," he said, eyeing the sheet. "Lily?" "She's just in the bathroom," another stranger said. "All right, we'll take her when she's back." And then the sun was going down. How long would this support session run for? I couldn't wait for them to close up shop for the evening. I couldn't come back tomorrow. I couldn't wait. I couldn't fucking... "All right, got a Jake Miller here? Jake?" "Me!" I shouted. Immediately I stood from my seat. I had the horrific thought that my body would turn itself around. I'd leave the church and walk right into the sunset. But instead my footsteps made their way up the aisle, and then I was standing right in front of him. "To the back," he said, and I followed him there, a rather confusing and twisting pathway past closed doors, boxes, mess, and hallways until we got there. To a confessional booth. "In there?" I asked him. "In there," he said. I entered the booth. There was blood on the seat. Blood. What a novel sight. "Take a seat. Don't worry about the dried. You know, it's fine. You'll be good. Sit," said who I presumed was the priest sitting on the other side of the partition. I did as he requested. "Reverend Lucien?" I asked. It took him a second to respond, to register. Yes, Reverend Lucien, sure." I continued, "I haven't really done this confessional thing before, but I guess, are you supposed to ask me to confess something?" "Yes, please confess whatever is on your mind." I took a second to gather my thoughts. "Right, yes, so..." I heard the sound of something being cleaned by a cloth, followed by a deliberate echoing snap. Was he eating? "Right, so I saw your ad, found your ad rather, and I suffer from worship fear, I guess. I don't want to commit blasphemy against the Lord or anything, but..." I heard the echo of another bite. Jesus, a little rude man. "But not sure if I want to stand in a field for 100 years in a worship, I guess." "It's not 100 years, he said, chewing loudly. "It's forever. Eternity." That was his little project. His little what now? Heaven on earth, eternity. That was always the plan. For all of you to become one with the Lord for the rest of time. Of course he wanted to show up when there was the most people, right? He said, crunching, like probably... He stifled a laugh. "Probably less exciting when it's fucking cavemen, right? Billions of people? Or 10,000 cavemen? Which would you choose? I'm sorry. What does this have to do with anything? Nothing, sorry, please continue. Right, I said, gathering. And, no, I guess that was it. It said you have a surefire solution? On your ad, yeah, he said. I can kill you. You can kill me? Yeah, right here, right now. Of course, if you need time to think about it, it's a no. And if you step out of the church, God will summon you right then and there to be a part of the flock. That's what, how would you know that? What's your answer? There are people waiting and I'm a busy guy. Busy, Reverend. The answer would be yes, but that'd be in violation of Commandment 3, or sorry, I guess, you don't know what that is. Basically, I've been trying to keep track of everything, and Commandment 3 is my shorthand for the whole. If you try to... Suddenly, the partition fell. Swiftly came the knife into my jugular. I couldn't believe it. Blood spilled onto my shirt, my legs. I gagged, my vision blurring as I tried to focus on the man who delivered the blow. The man who had a bloody knife in one hand, half-eaten apple in the other. The Lord and I have an agreement, he said. He has his space and I have mine. Albeit this one is much smaller than what I'm used to. I felt my head lower involuntarily. My eyes acclimated to the final shot, myself drenched in red. You're welcome, I think I heard him say, and then it all went black, a miracle. The glow of the laptop illuminated Zora's face as she clicked through her world in Minecraft. Her favorite mods, the ones that added ores like endium and mysterious mechanics tied to the internet, made her game unlike anyone else's. She'd been tweaking one particularly strange mod she found in an obscure corner of the internet, one promising a connection to the unseen layers of reality. That night, the screen stuttered as she loaded her world. Strange, she thought. It was a single-player game, and her Dell Latitude rarely struggled with Minecraft. She shrugged it off, assuming it was just the mod misbehaving. Her spawn point seemed different. The familiar savanna biome she'd built her sprawling base in was gone, replaced by a featureless black void. No sky, no horizon, just endless darkness. Her inventory was empty, her hotbar wiped clean. Must be a bug, she muttered, typing /kill to respawn. Instead of reappearing, her character fell. The falling lasted longer than it should have, the UI coordinate ticking down into impossibly negative numbers. -100, -1,000, -10,000. The screen went dark, then came the whispers. At first, Zora thought it was an audio glitch. The static in her headphones seemed to form vague patterns, almost like words, just on the edge of comprehension. She pulled them off and leaned back, but the whispers didn't stop. Zora. She froze. It wasn't coming from her headphones. The sound was emanating from her laptop cooler. The faint hum of the cooling fans had been normal earlier, but now it was different. The fans pulsed in sync with the whispers, rising and falling like a labored breath. Heart pounding, she unplugged the cooler. The whispering ceased, but her screen flared back to life. Her character stood in a cavern now, dimly lit by flickering redstone torches. Symbols carved into the stone walls glowed faintly. Symbols she didn't recognize, yet somehow understood. She wasn't alone. A figure stood at the far end of the cavern. Its skin resembled bedrock, and its eyes were voids, perfect, lightless circles. It didn't move, but she felt its presence like a pressure on her chest. Her hands trembled as she pressed escape. The menu didn't appear. She tried Alt F4. Nothing. Hello, Zora. The chat box popped up on its own, text filling it faster than she could read. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the messages weren't just on her screen. They were being typed, one by one, on her phone lying nearby. Why did you bring me here? The figure began to move, gliding closer, its void eyes boring into her. She mashed her keyboard, trying to close the game, but it was futile. A final message appeared in the chat. You connected me. Now I'm here. Her Dell Latitude shut off abruptly, the room plunging into darkness. The whispers returned louder this time, surrounding her like a swarm of invisible bees. She grabbed her phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But the screen displayed only one thing, a to-do list. Bring it more, dig deeper, let it out. When the power came back hours later, her computer was gone, replaced by a smooth slab of polished black stone. The glow of the USB lights on her laptop cooler resumed, faint and steady as if watching her. and in the shadows of her room, something with void-like eyes began to stir. I've always been a man of routine. Every morning I brew a pot of coffee, walk the creaky floors of my old farmhouse, and sit by the window overlooking the woods. The house has been too quiet since Alice passed. She was the love of my life, and now it's just me here rattling around in these empty rooms. Lately, though, things haven't felt right. This morning, as I sat by the window with my coffee, something about the woods unsettled me. The trees looked different, too close, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. And I saw movement out there, shadows slipping between the trunks. I told myself it was just wildlife, maybe deer or foxes. But the shapes were too tall, too human. I shook it off. I've been lonely after all. Maybe my mind is playing tricks on me. The noises started about a week ago. At night, when the house should have been still, I heard footsteps upstairs. They were soft but deliberate, pacing back and forth. I didn't panic. The house is old, and old houses make noise. But when I finally went upstairs to check, I found something I couldn't explain. The door to the guest room was open. I always keep it locked. I stepped inside and froze. The room looked just as I remembered it. The bed neatly made, the rocking chair in the corner, Alice's old books stacked on the nightstand. But something about the air felt wrong, heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. I backed out, shut the door, and locked it again. The sounds didn't stop. They only got worse. Footsteps turned into heavy thuds. The whispers started next, low and guttural, coming from the walls. And then the objects began appearing. I found Alice's favorite scarf draped over the chair in the living room. A photograph of our wedding, its glass cracked, lying on the kitchen counter. I don't remember moving these things, but who else could have? I called my son David to tell him what was happening. He listened, but I could hear the patience in his voice, the way he was humoring me. "You're just lonely, Dad," he said. "Maybe it's time to move closer to us. This is my home. I'm not leaving." Last night, I woke up to the sound of the guest room door slamming shut. My heart thundered in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and crept upstairs. The door was wide open. Inside, the rocking chair was moving on its own, its wood creaking under an invisible weight. Alice's books were scattered across the floor, their pages torn and fluttering as if caught in a breeze. And then I saw her. Alice. She stood in the corner, her back to me, utterly still. Her silver hair hung in stringy clumps. "Alice?" I whispered, my voice shaking. She turned slowly, and I wished she hadn't. Her face was pale, her eyes black voids that seemed to pull me in. Her mouth moved, but the words were drowned out by a deafening roar that filled the room. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. When I looked again, the room was empty. I tried to stay away from the guest room after that, but it felt like the house wouldn't let me. The noises, the whispers, the slamming doors, they all drew me back. Tonight I couldn't resist. I stood in the doorway, staring into the room. It was bare now. No bed, no rocking chair. The walls were scrawled with messages in a trembling hand. "Where am I? Help me. Why did you forget?" The words filled every inch of the walls, overlapping and chaotic. In the center of the room was a mirror. I stepped closer and looked into it. I didn't see myself. I saw Alice. She was screaming, her hands pressed against the glass. Her mouth formed the same word over and over. "Remember." The memories hit me all at once. Alice, frail and sick, lying in a hospital bed, her voice begging me to stay with her, the beeping machines, the moment she slipped away. I remembered her funeral, the empty house, sitting in the guest room night after night, unable to let her go. And then I remembered forgetting. I forgot Alice. I forgot the love of my life. This morning David came by. I don't remember calling him, but he's here now, walking through the house calling my name. He found me in the guest room, sitting in the corner. The walls are blank now, the mirror cracked and dusty. "Dad," he said softly, kneeling beside me. "What happened?" "She's still here," I whispered. Tears streamed down my face. "I see her. She's angry because I forgot her." David's face twisted with grief. "Dad," he said gently, "Mom's been gone for years. You're just confused." But he doesn't understand. She's not gone. She's in the walls, the floors, the very bones of this house. David took my hand and helped me to my feet. "Come on, Dad, let's get you some help." As we left the house, I glanced back at the guest room. The door was open, and inside, the rocking chair moved ever so slightly, creaking in the silence. It was an 8-hour drive back home. I'd been visiting my dad for his birthday, but I had to get home. I hadn't been able to get time off work the next day, so it was going to be hell and a half if I didn't get there by morning. The weather wasn't on my side either. What had started as a mild wind had escalated to an incessant howling, rocking my car with gusts of wind that nearly knocked me off course. I could barely hear the radio over the raindrops knocking on my sunroof. I was 6 hours in when I came across a fallen tree. Another car had stopped ahead and called it in, but I didn't have time to stick around. I took a detour onto a smaller road. It was rural Minnesota. What's the worst that could happen? The road was more pothole than asphalt, but my GPS was still on point. It showed a 20-minute detour, but I figured it'd still be quicker than waiting for that tree to be cleared. I rounded a corner and came across a long stretch of road overlooking the countryside. There was a wheat field to the left and a pine forest to the right. It was dark, so I couldn't see anyone up ahead. No lights. I kept going straight, leaning back in my seat. All of a sudden, a car. It was parked by the side of the road. I swerved, but I ended up smacking it and cracking a taillight. I came to a full stop about 20 feet further down the road. Looking back, I bit my lip. I could keep going, and that'd be that, or I could leave my insurance information. I dug around in my glove compartment and found a slip of paper, tucked it under my jacket, and got out. I made my way over to the parked car. It was a dark beige sedan that looked like it had been dug out of the 90s. I didn't want to pry, but I couldn't help but to see something odd. There were at least 3 duffel bags in the back seat. I got my papers out and slipped them under the wipers, along with a $20 bill as an apology. I was walking back to my car when I noticed someone approaching. I noticed a couple of details. They had a dirty shovel flung over their shoulders and were holding another duffel bag. That made it 4 in total. I had this uneasy feeling. I was looking at something I wasn't supposed to. This person had been digging something up in the middle of a rainstorm. I couldn't imagine they wanted someone to see them do it. I got out of the rain and into the driver's seat. I put the keys in and fired up the engine. It made a bit of a huffing noise as if wanting to stall, but it didn't. Then someone knocked on my window. I could have put my foot on the gas, but I didn't. Instead, I turned my head, only to see a stern-looking man in his early 50s. He had a thick mustache and a black baseball cap, a look that made me think of someone trying their best to be forgettable and neutral. He was holding a gun. He made a rolling motion with his hand. "Let's have a short conversation before you go running off, sir," he said. "It'll just be a couple minutes." I rolled down the window. It was dawning on me just how bad this could get if I wasn't careful. We were alone on a small nondescript road during bad weather, and no one knew I was there. And he didn't look like the type of person who was eager for a rational discussion. "Sorry about the taillight," I said. "Mind lowering that pistol there?" He forced a smile. "I would mind, yes." He reached his arm in through the open window and unlocked the door. Opening it, he motioned for me to step out. I looked back at the steering wheel, not sure what to do. Maybe I could get away if I did something sudden. "I wouldn't do that," he said. "It'll get messy." "I didn't see anything," I assured him. "I'm just passing through." "I'm sure you didn't. Now step out." Looking down the barrel of a gun, I was inclined to listen. I stepped out. My mouth went dry as my senses heightened. I could feel the blood rushing to my head. "I don't know what you think I saw," I said. "It was just a duffel bag and a shovel. I don't even know you." "Just step right this way," he said, pointing me to the side of the road. I didn't see the license plate. "Hell, I can hardly see you. It's raining too much, you know?" "Fair enough." He pointed at something up in the pine woods. "Can you see that?" he asked. I leaned in and looked closely. There was nothing up there, just pine trees and rain. Then I realized what he was doing. He was making me stand still. I didn't have time to turn my head before he fired the gun. Now, a lot of stories would have ended here. That would make sense. Even though I barely knew the guy or what he'd done, he wasn't taking any chances. He shot me point blank in the head. I had no idea what happened next, but I figured out a couple of things. He pushed my car into a lake and he buried me in a shallow grave just east of that road, in a field, right up a hill. Writing it out like this, it seems almost detached. Like it didn't really happen to me, like it happened to someone or something else. But I can't say it any other way. He killed me, and I didn't even understand why. In terms of time, it felt like blinking. One moment there's a flash and a bang, the next I'm inhaling dirt. I almost choked then and there, a first sour breath, bitter with the salt of the earth. I flailed around until the air touched my fingertips. Then I dug. I gasped for breath, but all I got was mud and grass. Finally, my face broke the surface. I wheezed, sucking in the night. Only then did I realize that my heart was still beating out of my chest. I was still surprised by the loud sound, the gunshot. The rain had seemingly cleared up, but it was late. I was out in a field. It was a small glade in the middle of a pine forest, where I was surrounded by these strangely colored sunflowers. They were probably white, but they looked kinda blue in the moonlight. I just had the clothes on my back. He'd taken my phone, my car keys, my smartwatch, everything. He'd buried me alive, I thought. But the strangest thing about it was that right where I'd been lying, there was a cross. It was crude, a couple of broken 2x4s nailed together. It looked more like a plus. But what the hell kind of murderer leaves their victim alive and marks their grave? That's when it hit me. He didn't leave me alive, he'd shot me in the back of the head. I touched my skull back to front, but there was nothing wrong with it. Not even a bruise. Physically, I was perfectly fine. But that just didn't make any sense. What the hell had happened? How could I be okay? I had no idea where to go, so I just picked a direction and hoped for the best. It was dark, but the moonlight helped a little. Looking back at that weird glade, I couldn't help but feel watched, as if those creepy sunflowers were all turning my way. First things first, I was going to get to the police. This man was a menace. I had the time and a clear description in my head. The rest would work itself out. It took me about 20 minutes to make it to a road. The same road where I'd run into him, I figured. Or maybe that's just what all roads look like in rural Minnesota. In 2 hours, only a single car passed me on that road, and they weren't eager to stop for hitchhikers. I could see why the guy had picked this spot. It was the middle of nowhere. That I'd ended up there was just bad luck. Wrong place at the wrong time, apparently. Astronomical odds. I'd been following the road for longer than I care to admit when a couple of headlights slowed down behind me. Looking back, I could see a middle-aged woman driving a pickup. "You lost?" she called out. "Sort of," I said, turning my pockets inside out. "Robbed. Are you okay?" she asked. "Not really. Are you on drugs?" "I wish." She scoffed at me and leaned over, opening the passenger side door. "Get in." My eyes went heavy the moment I sat down. I felt the heat of the car melting my bones, turning my body into butter. I almost nodded off then and there. "Looks like you've had one hell of a night," she said. "Where you headed?" "The police, I guess," I said. "Can you call them?" "I can, but there ain't no one around till morning," she said. "Unless it's urgent." "It's kind of urgent. Look, you're not on fire and no one's hurt. They're not coming out to get you till morning, that's all I'm saying." I wiped some dirt off my face and nodded. "Nearest motel, then." "Nonsense," she smiled. "You can have my kid's room just for the night." "Appreciate it." Her name was Mary Ann. She worked at a water treatment plant not too far away and was coming home from a night out with her work friends. As a single mother to a now-grown kid, she didn't mind lending some empty nest space out to a stranger in need. I feel like between Mary Ann and the man who shot me in the head, I'd managed to find the two kinds of people you might run into in rural Minnesota. I got to borrow a room next to her garage for the night. I took a shower and threw my clothes in the washer. Mary Ann didn't have much food to share, but she microwaved me some leftovers, lasagna. We talked a bit about what had happened, but I didn't have much to say. It was so hard to describe. I couldn't just babble on about how I'd crawled out of a hole in the ground. So I said I'd been mugged and had my car stolen at gunpoint. It was an uneasy sleep. It's like my heart wouldn't settle down no matter how comfortable I was. I kept feeling like I was on the edge of bursting into a sprint, like there was still an immediate danger. It was like I kept hearing the click of the gun, anticipating the painful flash of the bullet burning past the hairs on my neck. The following morning, Mary Ann made breakfast. She was chatty, and making breakfast brought out the people person in her. "That road is trouble," she said. "But I guess you're not the worst thing we found there." "Oh yeah?" Yeah, she continued. Did you see hold on. She wiped her hands on a towel and lent me her phone. She had a social media post up about a dead man. I recognized him. It was the man, the one who shot me. There wasn't a lot to it. A small post talking about how he'd been a couple of weeks from turning 71, and how he'd passed suddenly in his car. There were dozens of posts talking about how much they were going to miss him, and how great of a guy he'd been. I figured they hadn't known much about his extracurricular activities. Good people don't shoot other good people in the head. Before I handed her the phone back, I noticed something odd. Right there by the time, the date. 31 days had passed. I almost choked on my orange juice. This was beyond explanation. It didn't make any sense. 31 days? I handed Marianne her phone back. I mulled the options over in my head. I wanted to call my mom, but I couldn't remember her number. It was saved on my phone, which was gone. Besides, what would I tell her? Again, you can't just tell people you've crawled out of a hole in the ground. I figured I could do a little research. Try to figure out what had happened before I went to the police. Maybe there was a logical explanation for all of this. Maybe I'd just missed it. If so, a little research was a small price to pay to not sound insane. Thanks, I said. You know where this guy lived? You know him? She asked. Sort of, I said. An acquaintance. I mean, yeah, I can show you his place if you want. I had to know more. There were too many questions in the air right now, and I had to get a couple of answers before I started to untangle it. If I could figure out why this guy had shot me in the head, maybe I could go to the police with something concrete. How the hell 31 days had passed would have to wait. Marianne drove me downtown. I don't remember the name of the town, but it was small. Basically just a collection of houses by the side of a quasi-busy street. It had gone from late autumn to early winter in those 31 days, and it showed. The morning frost was just melting off the sleeping trees. She turned onto a small road just off Main Street and up a hill. The house we looked for stood out like a sore thumb, the only white house with red detailing. It looked like a big shed had swallowed a candy cane. Hideous. It was clear that no one had been there in a while. Some kids had broken the windows. A couple of trees in the yard cast long shadows across the bare dirt, accentuating the Midwestern morning sun. There was that small town smell in the air, mud, melted frost, diesel. I thanked Marianne, and she handed me $50. There's a motel just down the street, she said. Ought to be a couple of rooms there if you need some space. God bless that woman. As she drove away, I walked up to the front door. The lock was broken, and there were a couple of spray tags on the side. The door was barely holding onto the hinges, having been rocked back and forth by harsh winds. The inside was pretty lackluster. The guy was clearly a loner. No pictures on the walls, no pets, barely any decorations. A couple of polite postcards from acquaintances piled up in the hallway. Empty plates on the kitchen table. Checking the fridge, there was half a six-pack and a jar of pickles. That's it. It was empty. If this guy was turning 71, there were no signs of a long life. In fact, there were no signs of anything. You could tell there'd been people going through the place. Furniture had been moved and broken. There were scratch marks on the floor from where someone had tried to break the floorboards. There was also some cigarette smoke. Maybe the guy was a chain smoker, but the place didn't smell like it. I wandered around not really knowing what to look for. I had this feeling that knowing why he'd tried to kill me might shed some light on things, but it really didn't. It's like the post said, he'd just tipped over and died. It was hard to accept that maybe, just maybe, I'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe I'd never know for sure. Still, the guy had it coming. Whatever the reason, you just don't kill people in cold blood. Leaving that house behind, the question remained. Why me? What did I do? There was no point in grinding it over and over in my head. I figured I'd get a room at that motel, get in touch with the police, and get back on the road. My family had to be worried sick. I felt a little bad for spending this much time running around with this nonsense, but it bothered me to no end. You don't forget waking up in a shallow grave. You just don't. I followed Marianne's directions and came across a gravel path. A long winding path over a hill and through the pine woods. I spotted a peculiar tree in the distance, a dead leafless oak. I decided to stop there to rest my feet for a bit. It had a root that curled around itself, making it an excellent seat. I sat down to ponder my options. But see, I do this thing when I'm deep in thought. I scratch something over and over with my left index finger. There's something about the sensation of running your finger over something textured that just numbs my mind. So as I sat there and considered my next move, I did just that. I scratched a bit. Right in that exact spot, something had already scratched the bark off. I pulled my finger back, sticky with sap. Someone had been sitting here, just like I was. They'd been scratching that spot, just like I'd done. Odd. Following the trail, I ended up next to 2 buildings down by the main road. There it was, the motel and a supermarket. There was a woman outside the motel smoking a cigarette. She kept looking my way, so I waved at her. "You here to pick up your stuff?" she asked. "What?" "Your stuff," she repeated. "I'll throw it away if you don't." "No, yeah, I'll get it, sorry." I had no idea what she was talking about, but she clearly intended to talk to me. There was no mistaking it, she'd seen me before. She was very comfortable in that fact, so much so that it made me question if we had history. I joined her outside the motel and waited for her to finish her cigarette. I got a stern talking to about leaving things behind. Apparently there was only so much space in the lost and found. I apologized, which eased the tension a bit. Maybe she was expecting some kind of entitled big city folk talk from me. She said she'd give me 20 minutes to clear out the room and handed me a key. I hurried down the hall and up the stairs. Standing outside that room, I didn't know what to expect. I'd never been there before. I'd never seen this woman, and yet, she seemed to know me. Or at the very least, she'd seen me before. When I entered, I could tell someone had been living there. There were some clothes and a couple of items scattered across the nightstand. It didn't take long until a chill crawled up my spine. The clothes in that room were my size. There was a toothbrush in a green plastic case in the bathroom, just like I always keep it. I'm a bit squeamish about bacteria, which begged the question, had I been there before? I decided to do a test. If I had been there before, my phone would be tucked away and hidden near the bed. I'd had some bad experiences with staff stealing my electronics in the past. So I leaned over the bed and fumbled around for a bit, and there it was. I found my phone nuzzled between the wall and the bed. But more than that, I found something hidden underneath. A black metal box with a 4-digit code. I tested the first 4-digit code that came to mind, and voila, it popped open. In it, I found a gun, 6 bullets, a stack of about 40 $100 bills, and a notebook. There was a knock at the door before I could explore a little further. "You finished?" the lady asked. "Sorry," I said. "It's, gonna be a while." "You staying? Would you mind if I did?" "You paying?" "Of course, yeah." "All right, then." I sat there for a moment, taking it all in. How could I have known it would be there, and how would I know the code? How could I have been in that room without remembering anything about it? It didn't make sense, but I was holding the proof in my hands. There had to be answers. I paid for a couple of days and locked myself in that room. I gathered all clothes and checked all the corners to make sure there was nothing else hidden in there. It felt strange, like I was following in my own footsteps, but I'd never been there before. I'd woken up in that field like no time had passed. What was I missing? I kept the TV on in the background just to fill the empty space. I checked the phone. There were a couple of outgoing calls. A few of them short, a couple of them a little longer. Some of them were dated from about 10 to 15 days after I was attacked. In the empty space I couldn't account for. Those were 30 days of my life that were just gone, but something had happened in between. There were a couple of texts, too. Most of them were just people being worried, asking if I was okay. There were a couple of replies sent from this phone, but just a few. They were short, just saying, "I'm fine." But one text stood out. It was from my younger sister. "Why are they saying you're dead?" she wrote. There had been no response. Dead? I immediately tried to call her, but my phone was disconnected. Either the service was discontinued or I hadn't paid my bills. Either way, I wasn't getting through. I decided to check the notebook. The pages were dated, starting at about 21 to 22 days after my supposed death. It mentioned waking up in a field of blue sunflowers, disoriented and looking for help. It mentioned getting a ride to town from an old man in a blue van. Other entries mentioned talking to people about my assailant, only to find out he'd already died. It seems that my first instinct was always to find the guy who killed me, and always finding out that he was gone. These notes spoke about an experience that was almost identical to mine. About waking up, about getting to a motel, about looking up the house of our attacker. Apparently, that's where they'd found the gun and the money. Maybe it hadn't been kids messing up the place, maybe it was me. The notes also mentioned a letter left behind. It just said that he was sorry, the note read. There were more notes. dates, connections, so I flipped to an empty page, grabbed a pen, and tried to put it all into a coherent timeline. It seems that about 10 days after getting shot in the head, I'd woken up in a field for the first time. I'd tried to find the man who did it, but he had already died more than a week prior. According to the notebook, the man had died either the same night that I did or the day after. Then, on day 20, I'd woken up in a field. Again. I'd made my way back to town to find the man who killed me, but he was already dead. For the next few days, I'd been locked up in this very motel trying to figure out what was going on. I'd made numerous calls, sent texts, and a couple of emails, only to be told that I'd been declared dead. Apparently, I'd walked into the police station on day 19 and fell over. Dead. Complete organ failure, according to the coroner. The notes warned me about contacting friends and family, telling me I'd just cause harm and confusion. For all they knew, I was gone. Talking to them would open a lot of questions that I couldn't answer. But I wasn't dead. I was right there, reading that notebook. From all I could gather, there seemed to be a pattern. Every 10 days, I would wake up in that field as if nothing had happened. I would believe I'd just gotten killed by that man, and I'd seek to either get help or revenge. But he was already dead. The world had moved on. But the notes didn't speak of me having seen any other versions of myself. So what exactly happened to every version? Did they all drop dead? The final entry hinted at an answer. It simply read, "I can feel my heart slowing down. I haven't been able to relax for over a week, and now it's getting hard to move. I have to pry my fingers open with my teeth. My toes have turned black. I'm seeing things. I see the one before me. I see you. Reading this, I know what is about to, and to prove it, I will put a cross on that spot. It will be the first thing you will see." The cross. The old man hadn't been the one to put that up. I had. This was the working theory. Every 10 days I would wake up in that field, and every 9 or 10 days after that I'd die, only for a new me to wake up, repeating the cycle. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I turned everything in that notebook in and out, looking for answers. There were a couple of notes about checking the library, talking to people about local legends, mentions of those strange sunflowers, but there were no answers. It was all dead ends and vague nonsense. I didn't know what to do. The first version of me had fumbled around, confused and scared, and died. The second version had tried to figure things out, but was still gone. What the hell could I do that those two didn't? And did this mean I was going to die in about a week? Every idea that I had was in that notebook. It was already there, and it had failed. I'd checked the soil in that glade. I'd talked to the locals, I'd researched similar myths and legends. I'd tried burying myself in that soil again as if I could go back somehow. But no, I'd been killed and buried among those flowers, and they refused to stop bringing me back. And it did so about every 10 days. I wasted that entire day trying to piece it all together. I fell asleep somewhere around 9 in the evening, still holding that notebook. I kept falling in and out of sleep, having these uneasy thoughts. I kept imagining that first breath as I breached the surface, digging myself out of a shallow grave. The confusion, the ringing in my ears from that gunshot. But there were other things in the dark of my dreams. The sound of my feet rushing into that house, desperately digging through a home, only to find a gun and a letter. Scaring off a few kids, making them drop their spray cans as they fled. Then there was the sound of people crying and screaming in my ear. Questions I can't answer. Desperation on all ends, building into this tight knot in my chest that no comforting word could untangle. Then a lake, aching joints. A final swim as my bones fossilized and decayed. I was at peace knowing I was about to go, and I chose to do it in a way where no one would be bothered. And now, me, here, alone in a motel, trying not to hear the ticking clock, trying not to think of what happens when my 10 days were up. The next day I sprang into action. I washed the cold sweat off my brow and decided to answer what questions remained in that notebook. I would do anything. There had to be a solution. Things always work out one way or another. Checking recently used apps, I found out that my previous iteration, the second copy, had used a map. They'd searched for nearby lakes. There was that one lake called Frog Lake nearby, and they just walked into it. That must have been the way they chose to end things, out of sight, out of mind. But the biggest questions remained. Why had that old man killed me to begin with? I fell into a vicious cycle of anxiety, desperation, and failure. I tried to find his car, but it had been destroyed. I tried to find any of his relatives, but he had none. All who had posted had been acquaintances and friends he'd made. I messaged a couple of them, using the motel Wi-Fi, but they either didn't respond or had nothing to say. I tried to check for prior convictions, but he had none. I tried to find out something about his gun, but it was unregistered and the serial number had been filed off. I couldn't even find out where he got the bullets. And why had he apologized? Why leave me money? The only thing I could think of were those duffel bags of his and his digging. There had to be a reason. The nights were getting worse. I was seeing little glimpses of things that had been: crying in the motel room, rushing into the police station, tearing out notes from the notebook and clawing at my face until it bled. Frustration, hopelessness, and desperation. And with every glimpse, every dream, I started to realize how futile this was. Every idea, every thought, everything I'd tried, I'd already done it. I was just repeating patterns. I was in a race against myself and nothing would change. On day 5, I made my way back out to that glade. Retracing my steps, I found that it was surprisingly close to where he had parked his car that night. Most of the ground there was gravel and rock, but the soil in that glade was soft and malleable. To me, the only thing that made sense was that he'd been digging for something up there. The cross was still up there. I couldn't stop looking at it. What had I thought as I put that up? Did I still have hope? That night I started seeing other things. Not just things that had been, but things that were to come, years from now. Waking in that same glade, the cross long since withered by age. A little bag left by the side, a welcome package. The sunflowers would still be there. The cars would look different, quieter, cleaner. Over time, the roads would deteriorate. The sun would be warmer. I'd draw thousands upon thousands of the same first breath over and over. I'd ask myself the same questions. I'd try the same things, and I'd come to the same conclusions. I forced myself awake before I went too far. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know. The clock was ticking. On day 6, I had completely given up. I just lay there in the motel room, watching daytime TV, eating stale chips from the supermarket across the street. I juggled 10-minute naps with bouts of existential panic, feeling my heart race through my chest as my lungs tightened. I could hear it in the back of my mind, that ticking clock. It was almost over, forever. I tore my hair out. I crawled into a fetal position, laying in the shower until the water turned cold. But whenever I closed my eyes a little too long, I'd hear myself drawing that first breath again and again, coming to the same horrifying realization. And before I knew it, it would be over. And it would be over and over and over. And I'd never really know what had happened until it was too late. By the night of day 6, I might as well have been dead. I just lay there, naked, on the floor, dissociating. I don't want to talk about day 7. It got worse, and I did a lot of things I wasn't proud of. So I'm skipping ahead to day 8. On day 8, I took a walk downtown. There was a corner pub where I decided to have lunch. By happenstance, 2 police officers walked in. They were having a discussion, and I couldn't help but overhear it. "That doesn't make any sense," one of them said. "How can the guy have his own bones in a duffel bag?" "That's the thing," the other said. "He must have had a twin. They were identical." "So, all these years there've been 2 of them and no one knew? It's like some parent trap shit," the officer laughed. "Can you imagine? Bones, duffel bag. There was something there. They had to be talking about him." I hurried back to the motel. My killer had been digging the night he killed me. He'd left his gun and bullets in a box, telling me he was sorry, along with some money. They'd found bones in his duffel bags that were identical to his own. But what if they weren't an identical twin? What if they were a copy of him, or maybe he was the copy? I bought a shovel of my own and made my way back out to that glade that same day. Checking the soil where I'd been buried, I dug, and I dug deep. Maybe there was a reason I'd been buried in a shallow grave. Maybe there was something else further down. I dug until my muscles ached and my lungs burned. I dug all afternoon in different places, and finally, I found something. About 5 foot deep, there was a body bag. It was covered in chemicals, but the smell was unmistakable. There was a corpse in there. I knew what I'd see before I even opened it. The zipper struggled, but it rolled open, challenging every sensation in my body. It's a strange feeling to hold your own face, to see your own closed eyes, to stroke your own hair in comfort, the little quirks and scars that only you know of, except for that one thing, a bullet hole. I collapsed to my knees. I'd figured it out. From a stray thought mentioned by a passerby, I figured it out. There was a reason that man had such a bare-bones home. Why he looked 50, although he was 70. He'd gone through this. He'd been in the cycle before me. Killing me and having me take his place in the ground must have broken the cycle. There was an end to it. That's why he apologized. That's the reason he just killed a random person by the side of the road. It wouldn't end until someone took his place. If not me, then someone else. So that meant that I had two options. I could go through this nightmare over and over, or I could end it. I could cut those who would come after me out of the equation and spare them the horror I'd felt. I could do that. Now I had options. That night, after I'd washed the dirt from my hands and knees, the dreams were different. I felt myself drawing another first breath, only to wake up under a starless sky, where the sun had gone dim and the moon hung closer than ever. I could hear rumbling earth as towering monolithic beings reached for the horizon sky. I'd see vaguely humanoid shapes roam a desert wasteland, stretching towards the heavens, crying for death, crying for an end to the cycle, like me. But there would be more first breaths, ones where I would wake up in a firestorm, only to burn to death. Ones where I would wake up choking under solid ice. Ones where I would be pulled up by inhumane scavengers, only to be torn apart and eaten, farmed and cultivated like wheat. And the cycle would continue, turning life into a grotesque broken mirror image of what I'd been told it would be. Lies and hopes made manifest by church, state, and peers. This was real life, uncompromising, uncaring, raw, and then there'd be no air. Then there'd be no soil. There'd be black. An impossible cold would snap across my crystallizing skin. My eyes would be open, but there would be nothing to see, no sound to hear but the popping of my eardrums. I'd fail to draw that first breath of air once every 10 days. Again, and again, and again. I woke up screaming on the 9th day. I had no choice. I had to break the cycle. Someone had to take my place in that void. I could see why he'd done it, and I would do so myself without hesitation. I grabbed the gun, the bullets, the shovel, and made my way to the glade. While the old man had just been bones, I had a whole body to take care of. It didn't matter. I could leave it out in the open, and it would make no difference. By the time it mattered, I'd be gone, and the cycle would be broken. So I waited by the side of the road, like he'd done. My body had been dug up and was ready to be moved. I didn't want to do it in the daylight, though, but time was running out. I didn't even care that I was going away. I just had to avoid that thing that were to come, the infinite awakenings that followed. A lot of cars passed me by. Some honked at me, others went out of their way to splash me with water collected in the many potholes. It wasn't until dinner time that a car slowed down to help. A good Samaritan, a pickup truck, Mary Ann. "No," I muttered under my breath, "just keep going, not you." But it was getting late. Could I risk waiting for someone else? She rolled down the window on the passenger side, smiling at me. Her radio clicked off. "You back here?" She laughed. "What kind of trouble you looking for?" "I'm fine," I said. "You can keep going." "Fine?" she scoffed. "You're right back where you started. Don't tell me you got robbed again." "Not this time, no." "So why you here?" I had my hand on my gun. There was no one else around. She was leaning forward and I had a clear shot to her head. I'd just raise my hand, click, and that would be it. It was simple. Would I risk missing this chance just for her to get some more time? In the grand scheme of things, what would it matter? And what if the next copy of me came to the same conclusion? What would stop them from pulling the trigger? It was either me now or me later. And if not her, then someone else. Did it matter who? I wouldn't be around to care. I could barely keep it together. My hand trembled. She leaned over, looking out the passenger side window. Her brow furrowed a little. I could tell she was concerned. "Look," she said. "I won't pretend to know your business, but I can see you're not doing well. You must have come across something real bad, friend," she continued. "I get it, but you know what I do when I feel bad?" She patted the passenger side of her pickup. "I do something nice. It does all the difference in the world. If you can't help yourself, then maybe you can help someone else. Does the heart good, you know?" A thought crossed my mind. I hadn't figured this puzzle out if it hadn't been for me just sticking around. It wasn't being smart or strong or suave. It was a stray bit of luck presented by two cops having a conversation. So maybe it didn't matter if I couldn't see a solution here and now. There could be a solution elsewhere, at another time, that I just hadn't seen yet. And maybe I wouldn't see it, but maybe the next me would. Also, by knowing what was to come, who was to say I couldn't stop it? This outcome couldn't be completely predetermined, or else I'd have told myself about it in that notebook. I had to believe there could be a better way, that there could be a solution and a beautiful ending, not just for me, but for everyone. I took my hand off the gun. I just gotta get something, I said. Can you give me a couple of minutes? Sure, she smiled. Don't keep me waiting. I rushed back up to the glade and nailed a note to the cross. The next me would get a welcome package. I followed Marianne back to town, but she offered to have me stay in her son's room again. I couldn't decline. I borrowed his computer, and that's why I'm here, writing this down. I need to spell things out in a way another me will understand, and I think this is a way to do it. So if I'm reading this, hello, I'm glad you saw the note. I hope this sheds some light on things. Maybe you can make it better for the next one. My joints are growing stiffer and my heart is slowing down. It's actually sort of pleasant. The worries start to fade. But the cycle will continue. I'll be gone before long, and I'll make sure Marianne won't find me. I've called the motel, telling them I'll be back soon, and to keep the room. I have the money for it, at least for a while longer. It is so easy to despair and so easy to forget our view. We can only see so far, and we can only hear so much. What feels like an endless darkness today can be a warming light by the morning. Sometimes, all we have to do is hope, to hold on, to do the best we can, and trust in the way things unfold. We don't even have to be smart about it or strong. Sometimes we just gotta be at the right place at the right time. I don't know how many hours I have left. It's strange to count yourself in hours. It's nice not to know for sure. I'm gonna go for a walk and see how far I'll go. Take a deep breath as if it's your first. You have all the time in the world. Ralph was a prankster. I don't think you can avoid becoming one if your name is Ralph. His parents cursed him at birth, ensuring he would forever be that guy who everyone wants to invite to the party, but who none of them can trust. I've been the butt of his jokes more times than I can remember. Store-bought gags, elaborate hoaxes, borderline scams. Water balloons, never just full of water. It's weird. Everybody liked Ralph in a group, but nobody liked him one-on-one. I don't know who invited him to Roger and Penelope's housewarming. It was a bad match. A dude who compulsively makes a mess of things just to see people's reactions in an incredibly expensive, brand new home owned by two rich tight asses. While we're talking about the curse of names, Penelope, really? Did her mother really want to make sure no one would ever take her seriously? She was a natural beauty, never wore much makeup and never made a fuss about her outfits, real low maintenance. The name, though, swing and a miss. The party was a small affair, just the homeowners and a few house guests. Tim was Roger's brother and, of course, Penelope's brother-in-law. I have to mention the second part, despite how obvious it is, because Penelope herself mentioned it at every turn. She grew up with 3 sisters, so finally having a brother was something she was excited about. Tim's kids, Layla and Aaron, were 16 and 13 respectively, just old enough to come to an adult function without completely ruining it, but still young enough to put a major damper on how crazy everyone could get. Their mother went on a corporate retreat, one trust exercise lead to another, and she left to shack up with the head of human resources. Layla was an artsy kid that fed on attention like a patient's parasite. Aaron was less demanding of time and would sit in a corner and listen to crime podcasts. If you're thinking about which one was older, you're probably picturing the wrong one. Paul was a screenwriter, at least in name, since nothing he sold had ever been produced. Every time you met Paul, every conversation that kicked off, he had a new project that was about to blow up. It's Golden Girls meets Breaking Bad. It's Nightmare on Elm Street meets The Matrix. It's Jurassic Park meets Diving Miss Daisy. No one ever asked what happened to each previous endeavor, since it was obvious everything he touched was condemned to development hell. Brent owned a high-end restaurant in the city, and despite the fact he never said a word about it, we all knew he was about to start a chain. He had been spending a lot of time in mysterious meetings lately, and a few loose-lipped staffers got the gossip going well enough for the idea to spread to his friends and associates. He knew Roger in high school, and the restaurant was actually where he took Penelope on their first date. She was no doubt impressed, not realizing Brent would never charge him. Then there was me, a guy who inherited his father's tire shop and drank in the office while the place essentially ran itself. Roger and I were lifeguards in college. We had systems and routines for picking up hot girls, And when some kid almost drowned one day, we legitimately forgot it was our job for a good half second. Relax, the kid was pretty much okay. If I had to guess, I would say Paul probably invited Ralph, hoping something wild would happen that he could then write a movie about. It wasn't long into the party when the prank was revealed, probably one of a couple he had planned. The doorbell rang, despite all the guests being present. Everyone was confused for a moment, other than Aaron, who was by the fireplace listening to the details of a quadruple homicide. Ralph's previously stone-faced demeanor broke immediately, a shit-eating grin uncontrollably bursting free. "Ralph, what is it?" Roger asked in his usual dry tone. "Why would I know?" Ralph asked through the biggest Cheshire smile you can imagine. "You guys are so suspicious. Who hurt you?" "You." Roger replied just as flatly, "You hurt us." Ralph shrugged and backed out of the room on his way to answer the door. "What? I thought the party could use a stripper." Tim's grip on his whiskey glass visibly tightened as he drew in a sharp breath and looked toward his daughters. Erin was still ignoring the world around her while Layla shot up from her seat and let out an excited gasp. "Sex work is real work. We should support women in whatever societal role they choose." Layla nodded emphatically, as if admonishing Tim for something he hadn't even said yet. "That thinking's not going to turn out good," Brent quietly remarked as he and Tim locked glares. "I'm handling it," Tim snapped. Paul perked up at the mention of a stripper. I don't know if he thought no one would notice or if he just didn't care. Ralph returned and, with a flourish, gestured to the dimly lit hallway leading into the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, children of two ages, I give you tonight's entertainment." "This isn't appropriate," Roger scolded. "Pay her and send her off." Brent agreed. Suddenly, a burst of color and noise erupted from the hallway in a flurry of awkward, unbalanced movement. It was Clown. A birthday clown. "Ralph, you fucker!" Roger let out a huge belly laugh, releasing everyone else's tension through his guffaws. Penelope was stunned. She was relatively new to Ralph's antics, at least compared to the rest of us. She just stared, jaw hanging open, as the painted fool for hire honked a horn, tripped over his own feet, and wobbled around the room singing "Happy Birthday" in a cartoonish, goofy voice. Layla ran to her sister's side and tapped her on the shoulder, pointing to the clown. "Sis, look, Dad's friend got a physical performer for an in-person experience." Erin pulled her earpods out, took one unenthusiastic look at the spectacle, and said, quote, "Kill me. I'm Mr. Muffins. What's your name?" "The clown, Mr. Muffins," asked Roger. "Marlon Brando." Roger answered, chuckling through the words, "Nice to meet you, Marlon. Can I call you Stanley?" The clown shook Roger's hand, acting as if Roger's grip crushed his hand. "Oof. You slapped Stella with that hand?" Mr. Muffin's first act was to make balloon animals for everyone. A dog, a cat, the usual. Brent asked for a monkey, and in a fitting turnabout of pranking, Ralph got a completely untouched snake balloon. Penelope was still quiet as she studied the balloon giraffe in her hands. "Hey, your favorite," Roger pointed out, still thrilled off his ass. "What made you become a clown?" Paul asked, throwing his arm over Mr. Muffin's shoulder and taking him aside. "Are you actually happy? Or is the smile makeup deep? You know the red nose you're wearing is a reference to the red nose of an alcoholic, right? Come on, Paul." Tim called after him. "Not everything is a character study. Let him entertain the kids." Brent was bringing a handmade, organic, fair trade artisan cake out of the oven as Mr. Muffins moved on to the next game. Hide and seek. "Cake has to cool," Brent noted. "We have more than enough time." Ralph slipped in. "Cocktails after." "Why not?" Roger added. With that, everyone found hiding spots throughout the house. It wasn't hard. This was an expansive 3-story monster of a home, and the more you explored, the more you understood the scope of just how wealthy Roger was. I don't know where everyone else went, but I pulled open a hatch to the attic, climbed up, and pulled it closed behind me. Since the house was newly built and the owners had just moved in, there was nothing else to hide behind after that. Layla volunteered to be it, and to find all the others. Surprise. The attic was nice, nicer than my first apartment by far, bigger too. I could have just started living up there, and there was a good chance no one would have ever noticed. Even the moon outside the attic window looked bigger than the one common folk get to see. It was weird. Just when it was finally sinking in just how long it would take for a hyperactive child to find 9 people, clown included, in the house to end all houses, a loud sound rang out. Layla was screaming, and it wasn't a "Dad bought me my first car" scream. It was a "someone is dragging me into a car" scream. Muffled by countless walls and 2 floors, the shriek was still unsettling and clearly one of terror. Dropping out of the attic and fumbling with my cell phone, I made my way through hall after hall, down the plunging mahogany staircase, back to the living room below, where we had gathered in the first place. I arrived to find the others already there, lined up shoulder to shoulder and staring at something I couldn't see quite yet. Tim had his kids gripped tight to each side as they held his midsection. As I joined the lineup, I saw the reason for the scream. Mr. Muffins stood in the center of the living room, wobbling on unsteady legs, blood pouring from an open gash along the top of his bald head. His miniature derby hat had fallen off and was floating like a paper boat in the growing red pool collecting at his feet. Mr. Muffins was holding his temples with his gloved hands, now stained bright scarlet, and it looked like he could have been holding his own head together. "I tell you," Mr. Muffins groaned, "I got a splittin' headache." In one quick, unsteady motion, Mr. Muffins lost his balance, stumbled forward into the kitchen, and fell face first into Brent's cake. He slid off of the counter and landed on his back as a whoopee cushion hidden in his pants let out a long, slapping fart. "Oh, what happened?" Ralph asked, dumbstruck. I'd never seen him authentically shaken before. An accident, clearly. Roger shook his head as if he was trying to get his thoughts to clear like a Polaroid picture. He must have fallen and hit his head. Penelope nodded in agreement, the color gone from her face. He was falling all around anyway. That's his whole thing. Slowly and methodically, Paul walked to the fireplace and picked up a fire poker from the floor. He turned it over in his hands a few times, then turned back to the group, showing us the blood and tissue still clinging to the business end. "Guys," Paul croaked, dread audible in his voice, "it's very bad things meets bozo." I dialed 911 and we all sat around, waiting for help to arrive. Tim pinned a duvet over the doorway to the kitchen in order to hide the scene from his girls. None of us wanted to ruin any evidence, and we weren't sure if the police would be upset if we left the scene of the crime. "Someone here did this," Aaron said after an impossibly long silence. "Quiet, honey," Tim said, use of the word honey doing nothing to soften the anger in it. "No, like, one of you guys killed that clown. I hope you realize that. We're all sitting with a killer." "That's not true," Penelope chimed in, all but in tears. "It's just not. Someone could have broken in, or maybe he did it himself. He bashed his own brains in with an iron rod." Aaron smirked, oozing sarcasm. "A show-stopping trick, but he can only do it once." "He might have. The funniest people are the most depressed," Paul helpfully explained, taking a sip from a drink held with 2 shaking hands. I expected to hear sirens at that point, but instead a musical tune filled the night just outside. It sounded like it was being played through a broken, rattling speaker. "Ooh," Layla perked up. "Ice cream?" Everyone jumped with a start as we heard the front door being kicked in suddenly. "Put your hands up, girls," Tim frantically commanded, before shouting out into the hall. "We're unarmed and there are children here. We don't know what happened." Seeing 2 kids put their hands far above their heads, arms extended at full length into the air, made me more afraid than anything else that night. I couldn't imagine what Tim was feeling at that moment. Heavy bootsteps echoed through the hall, walking slowly and confidently. It wasn't a match for the situation. "You're paying for that door. We could have let you in." Roger all but shouted. "Stop!" Penelope whispered loudly, "Just do what he says." A single police officer walked into the room, and as we took in the sight of him, some of us started to laugh again. His uniform was a deep purple, but otherwise it seemed to strictly adhere to regulation. His face was painted up, white grease paint, a red circle around his left eye and a blue one around his right. His bulbous clown nose must have had an LED light inside, as it also flashed red and blue. On his belt in a holster was a rubber chicken. Everyone put their hands down in unison. "All right, what seems to be the problem?" The clown cop boomed in a gruff voice. "I hear there's a clown down." Oh my God, Brent sat back in his seat and let out a hot breath. "You had us so scared." "Ralph, you're insane. This is too much." Ralph looked to Brent, then to the clown cop, then to me for some reason, then back to Brent. "I swear," he explained, "I have no idea what the fuck is going on. This is way beyond my capabilities as a jokester." "Quiet." The clown cop paced a bit in front of us, his boots clacking against the hardwood floor. "At this time I must inform you that you are being detained. You are not under arrest, but you also may not leave, and I'm going to ask you all to remain seated." This is absurd. Penelope folded her arms and made a skeptical face. The clown cop slowly walked to the duvet doorway and, pulling the cloth aside, peered into the kitchen. With his back to us, I could see the very prominent "Kick Me" sign taped between his shoulder blades. Absurd? He didn't even turn to face us. A dead clown, a murder victim, is absurd to you? Aaron turned to Tim and, with a steely and unflappable tone, gave him a lesson in clown-based murder lore. John Wayne Gacy didn't work alone either. The clown cop, now standing in front of us again, took the radio from his belt and spoke into it. "Yeah, we got a possible culricide. I'm here and I have the clown scene locked down. Looks to be a party. Victim must be a performer. Way too many old fat people, though. Something's not adding up." As soon as he let go of the radio's button, a squawking response of various fart noises answered him back. Brent stood up suddenly, much to everyone's dismay. Penelope gasped into her hands. "Well, sorry to be so upfront, officer, or whoever you are. But if you're looking for a killer, it couldn't have been me." The clown cop stroked his chin and furrowed his brow at Brent. "And why might that be, boss?" Brent lifted his arm to about chest height and stopped. "Spinal injury. When I was at Chef Collage, a stack of pans fell on me. Haven't been able to lift my arms over my head ever since. No way I could have raised the weapon high enough to bash that clown on the head." The clown cop reached deep into his pants, drew out a red and white striped baton, and walked up to Brent, clearly skeptical. He put the baton to each of Brent's elbows, one after the other, and pushed upward a bit. Still, Brent's arms didn't raise any higher than they had been. "I see," he mused. The clown cop turned to the fireplace, took note of the bloody poker Paul had leaned against the wall, then turned back to Brent. "That's the murder weapon, then?" We all nodded. The clown cop soon nodded along as well. "I believe you." Brent turned to the rest of us, his back to the clown. "See, it's just that easy." Behind him, the clown cop reached into his own pants again, pulling out a length of wood, a handle, an axe. Before any of us could fully comprehend what we were even looking at, the clown cop spun in place several times and took a huge swing. It was surprisingly silent in the room as Brent's still smug-looking head tumbled from his shoulders and rolled across the carpet. We heard the smack, the splatter, the thud, all before the first person started screaming. "What the fuck are you doing?" Roger yelled, standing up now despite how it worked out for Brent. The clown cop answered without hesitation, "Eliminating suspects." "I'm gonna need your name and badge number," Paul mumbled, wide-eyed, wavering on the edge of going into shock. "No problem, sir." The clown cop shoved the axe back down his pants and gave his leg a shake. "It's Officer Oscar Aquifer, and my badge doesn't have a number. I found it in a box of Clown Krispies." Ralph jumped up and made a run for it, bolting past Officer Aquifer and leaving everyone in the dust. Aquifer turned slightly, his arm seeming to dislocate and extend beyond normal limits, grabbing Ralph by his belt and throwing him to the floor as if he'd been yanked back by a large rubber band. "Please, sir." Aquifer remained eerily professional sounding. "Don't make me tell long arm of the law jokes, it's tired material." He reached down his pants with both hands, jiggled around in there for an uncomfortable amount of time, then drew out a notepad and pencil with each hand. "All right, walk me through the series of events that lead us to this situation." We made Ralph explain what happened, since it was entirely his fault in our estimation. He went through why he had hired Mr. Muffins, what agency he had called, where he saw the ad posted. Everything right up to the point of playing hide and seek. "Where did everyone hide?" Officer Aquifer asked. Tim and I had been exchanging looks whenever the clown cop wasn't watching. Through hand motions and meaningful stares, I had gotten across the idea that I knew how to get him and his girls out of the house. He was waiting on me for when and how. We should all go back to where we hid, to recreate our steps. I blurted out, trying to sound as concerned and as helpful as I could be. "I was under a table in the hall," said Roger. He was red-faced and sweating bullets, clasping Penelope's hand like if he let her go, they'd be separated forever. "I was under a bed on the second floor," Penelope added. Paul finished what was left of his drink. "Closet, second floor. Penelope's closet, but I didn't know before I got in." Tim started to speak up, but I subtly put my finger to my lips to silently shush him. "I was in the garage," Ralph cleared his throat. In the sports car, pretending to drive it. I saw where Tim hid." I stood alongside Roger. "I saw him and the girls hide in the attic." Layla looked confused. "No, that's not," she started. "Shh." Tim fussed with her hair nervously. He saw where we hid, honey. It must not have been a good spot, we can admit it. Tim took the girls up in the attic. I repeated, turning back to look at the three of them. Right? Yeah. Tim nodded deeply, overselling the lie. The girls and I hid in the attic. Since I had actually been the one up there, I had to tell a second lie to the cop and come up with a fake hiding spot quickly. I was, in the shower, one of the showers. All right, everyone to their places then. Officer Oxifer commanded with a few finger snaps. I'm sure every last one of us was thinking of running, but given the impossible feats we had seen out of this civil servant circus freak, it wasn't very clear how to do so. I pulled Tim aside as we all left the living room, Oxifer watching over us like a hawk. There's a window in the attic, leads to some lattice. When we're hiding, take your kids and go. I whispered as quickly as I could manage. Yeah, no shit I will. Time whispered back, you know I didn't do it, right? I don't care, I growled. If you did it, good. Fuck that clown. Fuck all clowns. Right about now, I wish I had done it. Officer Oxifer was a chilling presence as he followed the group to the first hiding location. So I was under this table, Roger said as he got on all fours with a groan. In fact, I hit my head on the overhang. You can see here where I chipped it. Officer Oxifer knelt down next to Roger and studied a small break in the wood, then looked to Roger's head where he must have seen a red mark from the collision. Well, I'll be damned. Oxifer grumbled. This is where you were. Officer Oxifer stood up, his hands diving into his pants. No! Penelope shouted. No, no, no! Paul and Ralph held her back as Roger looked up from his place on the floor, just in time to see a sledgehammer being brought down on his back. We rushed Penelope out of the hall, none of us looking back as the sound of metal battering meat sounded over and over and over again. Another suspect crossed off. Officer Oxifer proudly stated as he joined us again. Penelope was a sobbing heap. Ralph reached for the handkerchief in her blouse pocket, I guess to wipe away the tears and snot running down her cheeks as she was inconsolably weeping, but she batted his hand away. Leave me be! Just leave me to die, she screamed. The rest of us got to our hiding spots without incident. I was the last to hide since I wanted to make sure Tim, Layla, and Aaron got to the attic. They closed the door from inside as Officer Oxifer and I stood watching from the floor below. It wasn't until that moment that I felt the chill run up my spine. At no point had I realized I was ensuring I'd be alone with the clown cop. Just him and me, side by side, in a swelling silence. The stillness was broken by another scream. It was a war cry. Ah! Both Oxifer and I turned on our heels to see Paul, necktie flapping behind him, as he came running toward the both of us, an umbrella in his hand, held like a spear. Paul, no, I shouted, not for my safety, not for Oxifer's, but for his. The distance was closed quickly as Paul buried the pointed end of the umbrella into Officer Oxifer's chest. Oxifer stumbled backward and fell to the floor. Paul stood, huffing and puffing, as I rushed behind him. Paul, what the fuck? I did it, I killed him. The clown? Yes, wait, which clown do you mean? The original one. What? Number, I meant the cop. I killed the cop clown. But not the first one. Right? Because I was wondering, since you picked up that fireplace poker and got your fingerprints on it in front of everyone, it seemed like you might have done it to explain why you had touched it. That'd be a very obvious and pedestrian clue. I'm a writer. I, of all people, would have thought not to do that if I were guilty. I yelled out in surprise as Officer Oxifer sat bolt upright. He got to his feet, pulled the umbrella out of his chest, and ripped open his shirt. Right there below the cloth was a thick black square of body armor with yellow block letters that read, Umbrella-Proof Vest. With a blindingly quick throw, Oxifer launched the umbrella straight through Paul's neck, lodging it in his throat and stopping his death scream with a wet glug sound, releasing a spray of blood. The umbrella opened behind his head and he fell backward to the floor. Officer Oxifer gathered his wits and focused his attention back on me. So, you were in a shower? I looked around at the blood spatter marking the walls, the art around me, a porcelain giraffe, a landscape painting of an open grassland, little wood carvings of exotic animals. No, I admitted. Oxifer wasn't taken aback by my admission. He had no visible reaction whatsoever, and the colorful makeup on his face made it impossible to read his true emotions, if there were any. I want immunity, I clarified. Immunity from what? You. Are you actually asking me that? You want immunity in return for what, exactly? I took a deep breath, fully feeling the weight of yet another life on my shoulders. I know who killed Mr. Muffins. Oxifer reached into his pants again. I was cornered. He stood between me and the hall, and a wall stood behind me. Before I could start begging for my life, he pulled out a tremendous stack of paperwork. "Sign this," he said, handing me a suspiciously warm pen. I did as I was told. There was no way I could go over everything. There were hundreds of pages, so I didn't even start reading. As I scribbled out my name, Oxifer spoke. "I am prepared to offer immunity to yourself and the remaining innocent parties should you in fact provide information leading to the brutal slaughter of the perpetrator in this case." I lead the way as we proceeded into yet another of the many rooms of the house. "Come out," I said coldly. My brain told me I was doing the right thing, but my stomach told me I was a disgusting traitor who should be throwing up. Penelope slid out from under the bed. "What's going on?" she asked timidly. "Drop the act." I had decided on the walk there that I had to harden my heart and not give an inch of sympathy. "You did this to us. You started this whole thing, and there's an increasing amount of blood on your hands." Penelope had to face the two of us now, unlikely partners in the weirdest investigation to ever take place. "You caved in Mr. Muffin's skull." Penelope turned away from us dramatically, clasping her hands together. "Why did you do it?" Oxifer asked. "Did he catch you cheating with someone in the house? Did he see you snorting an illegal substance? Or are you just a killjoy, a bigot who has a grudge against all clown kind?" "She doesn't hate clowns." I stared hard at her back. "She is one." Penelope gasped and turned back toward me again, a hard look of betrayal in her eyes. Unfazed, I grabbed the handkerchief from her blouse pocket, and just as I expected, it kept going no matter how long I pulled. Handkerchief after handkerchief, color after color. I had proven my point. When Mr. Muffin showed up, you were surprised. Not because he was a clown, but because he was a clown you recognized. Sure, you're not wearing any makeup now, and you dress very modestly these days, so you thought maybe he wouldn't recognize you in turn. However, when he made your balloon animal, a giraffe, your favorite, you knew that he knew. And what's worse, he knew that you knew that he knew you knew. "It's true?" She fell to her knees, clasping my shoe in one hand and Oxifer's boot in the other. "He was my ex. I ran away from the big top just to get away from him. Oh, he was a beast, a monster. I tried to get a restraining order against him, but the courtroom was a circus. I changed my entire identity, but it still wasn't enough." "Sir, you don't want to be here for this," Oxifer said, ushering me out of the room. "You're still going to kill her, even though she's one of you?" I asked. I had been holding out hope that this wouldn't happen, but either way, the ordeal had to end. "Just keep moving. I have to pull an entire electric chair out of my pants, and it's best you don't see that." I got Ralph from the garage, and without any better ideas, we stood idly in the living room yet again. I explained everything that happened, but I think Ralph didn't believe most of it. "We have to kill him," Ralph insisted. "I don't think we can." I tried to get it through to him to no avail. After what he did to Brent, to Roger, to all of them, is Tim okay? What about the girls? The lights dimmed for a moment. "Tim got them out." "Well, thank fuck for that, but the rest? Shit, man, we have to kill this freak of nature." I watched passively as Ralph unpinned the duvet and made the flaming shots he had been wanting all evening, though he kept the alcohol in the bottles and stuffed the necks with rags. I think that even though this was all way out of control, even though none of us could have expected any of it, and even though Penelope had been the instigator, Ralph still felt guilty as hell since his prank had kicked everything off. I stood on the sidelines as Officer Oxifer came downstairs and marched into the room. Ralph was behind the center island in the kitchen, like a soldier taking cover. Oxifer surveyed the room slowly, then spotted us. "All right, I have to take you Clowntown to be debriefed. Don't worry, you'll get your briefs back after." As the first bottle sailed through the air, all I could think was that the light of the flame made the home feel more rustic and welcoming, like a booze-scented candle, I guess. Oxifer went up in flames instantly, engulfed from his flammable police hat to his flammable police boots. He didn't scream as the bottles continued to smash on and around him. Instead, he let out a series of comedic exclamations as his burning silhouette flailed around the room. "Oh no, the sofa!" he shouted as he fell onto it, setting it aflame. "Oh God, the curtains!" he shouted as he stumbled and wound himself up in them, spreading the flames to the ceiling. "Goodness, the minibar!" he shouted, falling over and toppling it. burning alcohol spattering everywhere. "Let's go." I grabbed Ralph by the arm as he lifted yet another wholly unnecessary bottle in an attempt to light it. "I think you did it." On the front lawn, Ralph and I met up with Tim and the girls. The light of the raging fire that was overtaking the house lit the yard up like it was midday as we all stared on in numb horror. A siren rose in the distance, and before long a fire truck screeched to a halt nearby. A jumble of clowns fell out of the fire truck, firefighting uniforms in every color but red, face paint running with sweat. After a series of antics and pratfalls, they finally got the fire hose out and pointed toward the house. It sprayed confetti and made everything worse. I was 19 when my mother came back, but she had died 5 years ago. It all started when I moved into that house in Bangalore, hoping to start fresh. But from the first night, something about the house unsettled me. The quiet was suffocating, and there was an eerie presence like something was waiting. I tried to ignore it, but as days passed, I began to notice more strange things. On the 5th day, I saw it again. The words "Nele Ba" scrawled on the back of the front door. It had been there when I moved in, written in faded white paint, and for some reason it made my skin crawl. I didn't understand what it meant, but I hated seeing it. It made the house feel even more haunted. I decided I'd had enough of it and painted over it, hoping to rid the house of whatever it was. My father was a workaholic. He'd come home late every night, exhausted from hours at the office. I didn't mind, but on that night something was different. The house felt colder than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finished painting the door and then went to my room, trying to ignore the growing unease in my chest. Later that night it happened. A soft knock echoed through the house. I froze, heart pounding. Then a voice calling my name. It sounded like my mother. I stood frozen in place, unable to move. "Come to the door, child," the voice whispered, gentle like my mother used to speak. But it wasn't her. I knew it wasn't. She had died 5 years ago. The knocking came again, louder this time, accompanied by the voice. "Come, open the door. It's me, your mother." I could hear the desperation in the voice, the pleading tone that I remembered from when she was alive. My hands trembled as I walked toward the door. My mind screamed at me to stay away, to not open it, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached for the doorknob, and just as my fingers brushed against it, the room around me grew cold. A sharp pain shot through my head, and before I knew it, blood began pouring from my nose. The cold sensation spread down my spine, and the room seemed to close in on me. I didn't open the door, but something inside me made me grab a sharp object from my desk. My hand moved of its own accord as if something was controlling it. Without thinking, I started carving the words "Nalba" into the wood of the door. I didn't know why. It felt like I had to, like something was compelling me to do it. The moment I finished, the darkness in the room overwhelmed me. My vision blurred and everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was in my bed. It was morning. The sun filtered through the curtains, casting soft light into the room. My father was lying beside me, peacefully asleep. The room was quiet, just as it should be. There was no knocking, no voice calling my name. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had. I could still feel the coldness of that night in my bones. The blood from my nose had stopped, but I was shaken, terrified, and confused. I didn't tell my father anything. How could I? I was too scared, too unsettled. I wasn't sure if what I experienced was real or if I had lost my mind. But I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay in that house any longer. A few months later, we moved. We found a new place, away from the eerie house that had haunted me with the knocks, the voice, and the words I had carved into the door. Whatever it was tied to that place, and I had no intention of ever going back to figure out what it wanted. Some things, I realized, are better left unexplained. It's strange how quickly my life unraveled. Where I am now is comfortable in a sense, but my body is decaying, breaking down by the second. I feel nothing but warmth, a smothering, all-consuming heat that I'd trade for an eternity in ice. Beside me lies my companion, peaceful and unchanging. She looks serene, her delicate features unmarked, but I can't share her stillness. I should have thrown the ring away the moment it was given to me. It started just a week ago. For my 21st birthday, my father gave me the trip of a lifetime. A week in his homeland, all expenses paid. We grew up moderately poor until his import business suddenly flourished, something he never liked to discuss. My father specifically almost desperately wanted me to go. His hands shook as he handed me the plane ticket, though he tried to hide it. Looking back, I wonder if he had any choice at all. My father had come to this country years ago and built a name for himself, creating a business that stood the test of time, almost incredibly so. Where others failed, my father succeeded against impossible odds, like finding a needle in a haystack. Now I understand the true cost of that success. My mother, innocent and proud of his achievements, helped me pack for the trip, suggesting places to visit and foods to try. She had no idea she was helping prepare for something that would take her son away forever. When I said goodbye, my father hugged me for the longest time, as if afraid it would be the last. His grip was desperate, almost painful. I assured them I would be fine, but even though he smiled, I could see the anguish in his eyes. My mother stood beside him, happily waving, unaware of the weight crushing my father's shoulders. I couldn't shake the look he gave me as I left, like a man watching his world end. It's only now that I'm beginning to understand everything, now that I have nothing but my thoughts to accompany me. I arrived at the hotel brimming with excitement, eager to explore the culture, food, and sights. The first day passed in a blur of vibrant markets and new experiences. Everything was perfect until the second day, when something began pulling at me, like an invisible thread tied around my soul. By the third morning, I found myself inexplicably drawn to a shrine on the outskirts of the city. It was a long walk from the hotel, but my feet seemed to know the way, as if following a path laid out long before I was born. As I approached, I noticed people staring, their eyes filled with recognition and pity. An old woman tried to approach me, her eyes tearing up, but something seemed to frighten her away. That should have made me turn back, made me return to the safety of the hotel, but I didn't. Even though I noticed their strange behavior, they seemed like mere passers-by at the time. The journey there was pleasant and calming on the surface, but underneath I felt a current pulling me forward. The path to the shrine was long, lined with lush greenery that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. Though the roads were confusing, something guided my steps unerringly to my destination. At the shrine, I saw locals dressed in ornate, elegant clothing that seemed to belong to another time. When they spotted me, they were friendly, their smiles knowing. They spoke to me in my language, though their lips didn't quite match their words. They were surprisingly willing to guide me, refusing any payment. The children who dragged me along had two bright eyes and laughs that echoed strangely. Still, I followed, pulled by the same force that had brought me to this place. Together, we explored the intricate architecture and watched a performance by locals dressed in traditional clothing. Their movements were fluid, their expressions serene, and the music felt otherworldly, because it was. I must have arrived at the right time, though now I know there was no other time I could have come. It was always meant to be this moment, this celebration, this trap sprung by my father's past. One of the women, her hair streaked with silver but her steps graceful as a dancer's, singled me out as the other locals danced. She pulled me into the circle, laughing as I stumbled through the steps. When the dance ended, she pressed something into my palm, a ring that felt warm as if it had been waiting years for my finger. The ring was silver, delicate, and strangely captivating. Its engravings were intricate, lines weaving into patterns I couldn't quite follow. I thought it was a gift for tourists, but it seemed too precious to just give away, so I assumed it was part of some ceremony. When I tried to return it, she grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Her voice was sharp and unfamiliar, and though I couldn't understand most of what she said, she did clearly say, "You keep it." I stammered an apology, and her expression softened. She whispered something under her breath, then released me before kissing my cheek. I should have pushed her away, but I didn't. I watched helplessly as she walked away, leaving me there. I returned to the hotel, confused. In my room, I turned the ring over in my hands, marveling at how it seemed to catch the last rays of sunlight. I slipped it onto my finger just to see how it looked, and was startled by how perfectly it fit. I must have fallen asleep admiring it, because the next thing I knew, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, a hotel clerk informed me that someone was asking for me by name. Confused, I followed him downstairs, and that's when I saw her. She stood in the lobby, her presence both out of place and commanding. Her hair was dark as ink, cascading down her back, and her eyes were a pale, piercing gray that seemed to see straight through me. Her clothes, though faded, were ornate, similar to what I'd seen at the shrine, but far more intricate. When she saw me, she smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of her lips that made my chest tighten and my stomach churn. "You are—" I managed to stammer, but she interrupted, saying my name in a soft, accented voice. I couldn't understand how she knew me or why she'd gone to such lengths to find me. But her presence was disarming, and I couldn't bring myself to question her. Instead, I invited her to join me for breakfast. Over the meal we talked, or rather she spoke, and I found myself hanging on her every word. She described her home, a place near the shrine, and her curiosity about the modern world. She seemed out of time, her wonder at the simplest things both endearing and unsettling. When it was time to part ways, she hesitated. She looked lost, almost frightened, and when I asked if she had a place to stay, she admitted she didn't. Against my better judgment, I invited her to my room. That night, she insisted on sharing the bed. I offered to take the sofa, but her quiet, pleading expression stopped me. Still, nothing happened. She simply lay beside me, her presence both comforting and unnerving. By the next day, everything was hazy. My memories of the hours that followed blur together like a half-forgotten dream. She guided me back to the shrine that evening, her hand warm in mine. The old woman was waiting for us, her expression unreadable. She took the ring from my fingers and gave it to the woman. With a smile almost blindingly bright, she slid the ring back onto my finger. Now I see her, the real her. Decay enriches her features. She looks more like a century-old corpse than the person she was, as the ring settles cozily on my finger. I want to scream but cannot. A smile rises on my lips as my words come out. I do. If anyone finds me, if my parents come looking, tell my mother this wasn't her fault. Tell her my father did what he had to do, made the only choice he could. The success, the comfort, the life we had, it all came with a price. And it seems I was the payment. I know now why he looked at me the way he did. I now know he also didn't have a choice. But I think it's too late for warnings or regrets. I feel it. The decay, painless but there. I want to scream, but a finger comes to my mouth, and I hear a whisper from the woman beside me, almost comforting. "You are home here. Let's sleep, dear." Some things you see, you can't unsee, no matter how hard you try. I've spent months replaying that afternoon in my head, asking myself if it was even real. But every time I close my eyes, I remember Donovan, what happened to him, how fast it all spiraled out of control, and the worst part, I can still smell the burnt flesh like it's soaked into my brain and refuses to leave. It happened on a Friday afternoon, a few blocks from our high school. Donovan and I were walking home like we always did, kicking rocks down the sidewalk and talking about the usual stuff, video games, girls we had crushes on, and the spicy ramen we'd tried last weekend. We'd been obsessed with spicy foods for years, like those weirdos who ask for hot sauce gift sets at Christmas. Donovan was even more hardcore than me. He kept one of those mini bottles of ghost pepper sauce on his keychain, just to flex. So when we saw the cart, it was like the universe was testing us. It was sitting at the corner of Blake and 6th, where the hardware store used to be before it closed. The thing looked way too professional to just be a random food stand. Sleek black panels, shiny chrome trim, and banners with block letters. Climb the heat pyramid. There was a colorful chart plastered to the side, showing all the peppers you'd expect. Jalapeno, habanero, ghost pepper, Carolina Reaper, and the new champion of heat, Pepper X. But above those were even more levels, names I didn't recognize, like Sun's Wrath and Devil's Grin. There were at least 10 more levels beyond what should have been physically possible. I should have known right then that something was off, but the vendor, man, he was smooth. He had the whole carnival barker vibe down to a science, grinning wide, gesturing dramatically, and calling us over with the promise of a new sensation. "Come on, gentlemen, how tough are those taste buds? Care to test your limits?" he said with a grin. "Today's your lucky day. Free samples, all heat, no charge." Donovan's eyes lit up. "Free?" "Absolutely. You just gotta prove you can climb the pyramid." The vendor's grin was way too wide, like cartoon character wide. "Think you've got what it takes?" I felt a knot in my stomach. I wanted to say no, but Donovan was already walking toward the cart like a moth to a flame. I couldn't just stand there, so I followed. The vendor handed us each a sample, a weird, puffy chip that looked like someone combined a Cheeto with a potato chip. It was dusted in a bright red powder that smelled dangerous. "This one's jalapeno, baby stuff," the vendor said, winking. "Let's see if you can make it to the top." We popped them into our mouths and the heat hit instantly. It wasn't anything we couldn't handle, just a warm-up, but it was sharp. Like the heat wanted to crawl into your gums and nest there. Donovan grinned and gave the vendor a thumbs up. "That all you've got?" Donovan teased. The vendor laughed. "Oh, we're just getting started." We climbed the pyramid fast, habanero, ghost pepper, Carolina Reaper. Each level was hotter than the last, but Donovan and I powered through. My face was sweating like crazy, and my throat felt like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper, but Donovan? The guy was in his element. He kept grabbing the samples without hesitation, grinning like it was the best day of his life. When we hit Pepper X, the burn felt like someone had taken a blowtorch to my mouth. I gasped, blinking tears out of my eyes, and clutched my knees as the heat punched through my sinuses. "Holy crap," I wheezed. "This stuff hurts." Donovan, of course, wasn't satisfied. "One more level," he said, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Dude, we've already hit Pepper X," I said. "Nothing's supposed to be hotter than this." "Wanna bet?" Donovan grinned and pointed to the chart. "Look at these other ones." The vendor leaned in with that same eerie grin. "He's right, you know. You've still got a ways to go if you want to hit the top." I tried to talk Donovan out of it. Something about this felt wrong. But Donovan wouldn't listen. He was already grabbing the next snack from the cart. This one had no label. It was jet black, like someone had rolled charcoal dust onto it. "Last one," Donovan said, popping it into his mouth. The change was instant. Donovan froze for a second, blinking hard, then smoke, actual smoke, began curling out of his nostrils. At first I thought it was some kind of trick or prank. Maybe the vendor had put dry ice in the snack to mess with us, but then I smelled it. Burning hair and scorched skin. "Donovan?" I whispered. He exhaled slowly, black ash puffing from his mouth. His eyes were wide, but he looked calm, too calm, like he was under some kind of spell. "Dude, you okay?" I grabbed his arm, but he didn't respond. He just smiled dreamily and reached for another snack. The vendor stood silently, watching with that same damn grin, like this was a show he'd seen 100 times before. "Stop him!" I shouted at the vendor. "He's burning! Do something!" The vendor shrugged. "He's climbing the pyramid. Can't stop him now." Donovan's skin started blistering. Red welts popped up on his arms and face, then burst open with little hisses of steam. He didn't even flinch. His hair, still damp with sweat, dried instantly and caught fire. I grabbed for the snack in his hand, desperate to stop him, but the moment my fingers touched it, pain shot through me like I'd stuck my hand into molten lava. I screamed and yanked my hand away, watching in horror as blisters formed and popped along my palm. "Donovan, stop," I begged, but he didn't even hear me. He shoved another chip into his mouth, his grin widening as his skin peeled away like paper. His teeth showed through cracked lips and his fingernails fell off, but he kept eating. Then the worst part, his eyes started to boil. At first they just looked cloudy, like he had cataracts, but then they swelled and hissed, little bubbles forming along the whites. Population. His left eye exploded in a burst of steam. Population. The right one followed. And still, he kept eating. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, screaming for help. My vision blurred with tears and sweat as I sprinted down the block, shouting for anyone who would listen. A couple of people stopped and stared in confusion, but no one moved to help. By the time I dragged a group of adults back to the spot, the cart was gone. No vendor, no snacks. No sign of Donovan. Just a greasy, blackened stain on the pavement where he'd stood. "Where's your friend?" one of the adults asked. I pointed to the charred outline. He was right there. They all looked at me like I was crazy. The police didn't believe me. They said maybe Donovan had gotten mixed up in some dumb prank or that I was in shock from witnessing something traumatic. They tried to tell me it was a hallucination or some freak incident, maybe spice poisoning. But Donovan's parents? They weren't buying it. They blamed me from day one, told everyone that I'd gotten their perfect son into trouble and run with the wrong crowd. They made it clear they thought I was covering up something worse, maybe even responsible for his disappearance. Every time I saw them, they looked at me with pure hatred. They moved away a few months later. I think it was easier for them to start over somewhere else, away from the town where Donovan vanished. The cops marked it as a cold case, a likely abduction, maybe a runaway situation, though they never found any leads. No body, no evidence, nothing. But I know what I saw. I don't touch spicy food anymore. I can't even walk down that street without feeling sick. And when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still smell ash in the air like a faint reminder of what happened. So here's my advice. If you ever see a card offering free spicy snacks, just walk away. Don't even look at it. Trust me. You'll thank me later. When I was a kid, my grandfather used to tell me strange stories about the forest behind his house in West Virginia. He called it the Hollow, a shadowy stretch of land that seemed to swallow sound. Even in the brightest daylight, it felt unnaturally dim, the canopy above weaving an oppressive quilt of leaves and branches. Grandpa would sit in his creaky rocking chair, pipe smoke curling around his head, and tell me tales about the strange things he'd seen. Most of them were harmless, glowing lights flitting between the trees or distant laughter with no source. But there was one story he refused to talk about until he was drunk on moonshine. It was the story of the lantern maker. Back in the early 1900s, there was a man who lived alone deep in the hollow. People rarely saw him, but when they did, he was always carrying an old iron lantern. He'd walk the forest at night, the flickering light barely illuminating his gaunt face and wild eyes. Some said he was a hermit. Others whispered he was a sorcerer. But everyone agreed he was dangerous. Local legends claimed he could weave strange things into existence with his lantern. It wasn't just light it cast. It was shadows, thick and alive. People swore they'd seen impossible shapes moving in the forest, things that were too large, too fast, and too quiet to be animals. One night, a group of drunken townsfolk decided to put an end to the lantern maker's witchcraft. They armed themselves with pitchforks, shotguns, and torches, and marched into the hollow. Grandpa said they never came back, not as men anyway. A week later, strange figures started appearing near the edges of the forest. They looked like men, but they weren't. Their limbs were too long, their eyes too wide, and their skin was a sickly pale gray. The townsfolk called them the lantern maker's creations, twisted things born from shadows and fire. One by one, the town began to empty. People packed up and left, terrified of what might crawl out of the woods next. Eventually, only Grandpa's family stayed, too stubborn to leave the home they'd built with their own hands. But one night, Grandpa saw him. He was just a boy lying awake in bed when he heard the faint sound of wings. Not the flutter of birds or bats, but a deep, leathery whoosh that made his chest vibrate. Curious, he crept to the window and peered out. At first, he thought it was a tree, tall and black against the moonlight. But then it moved. It unfurled massive, tattered wings and turned to face the house. Its eyes, red and glowing like embers, locked onto Grandpa. "I couldn't move," Grandpa whispered to me decades later. "I wasn't scared, I was just trapped. Those eyes held me, like they were pulling me out of myself." The creature stood there for what felt like hours before it finally lifted off the ground. The sound of its wings was deafening, shaking the entire house as it disappeared into the night. After that, Grandpa refused to go into the hollow. He said the lantern maker had made his greatest creation, a guardian for his woods. Years later, I forgot about Grandpa's stories. I grew up, moved to Chicago, and only visited him a handful of times before he passed. But recently I had to return to West Virginia to settle his estate. The old house was in worse shape than I remembered, creaking with every step, the walls peeling like dead skin. The hollow hadn't changed, though. It was still there, dark and quiet as ever. Something about it drew me in, the way it always had when I was a kid. On my last night there, I decided to take a walk into the woods. I don't know why. Nostalgia, maybe, or a foolish desire to prove to myself that Grandpa's stories were just that. Stories. I brought a flashlight and a knife, feeling absurdly brave as I wandered deeper into the forest. The air was colder than it should have been, and the deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no crickets, just the sound of my own footsteps. I was about to turn back when I saw it. At first, it was just a glimmer of light, faint and golden like a lantern swaying in the breeze. But then I saw the figure holding it. He looked just as Grandpa had described. Tall, gaunt, with wild eyes that glinted like glass in the lantern's glow. He didn't seem to notice me, his attention fixed on the lantern. Then the shadows began to move. They poured out of the lantern like smoke, twisting and curling until they formed a shape. A pair of massive wings, long, spindly limbs, and those eyes burning red like coals. The creature stepped forward, its talons digging into the ground as it unfurled its wings. The lantern maker didn't move, didn't speak. He just smiled. I ran. I don't remember getting back to the house. I don't remember packing my bags or getting in the car. I only remember those eyes watching me from the edge of the forest as I sped down the highway. Now every time I close my eyes, I see them. I hear the sound of wings in the distance, growing closer each night. I think the lantern maker isn't done with me, and I can't shake this feeling that I need to return to the woods. In the weeks since I left Grandpa's house, I can't stop thinking about the hollow. I dream about it almost every night now. In the dreams, I'm always walking through the forest, but it's not how I remember it. The trees are impossibly tall, their branches tangling into a canopy so thick no light can pierce through. I feel something watching me, but I can never see it. Then, without fail, the lantern appears in the distance, its golden glow swaying gently like it's waiting for me. Sometimes I see the lantern maker standing beneath it, his shadow stretching unnaturally long. Other times I see the creature. Its wings fill the entire sky, blotting out the stars, and its glowing red eyes burn into my soul. Every time I wake up, I feel an overwhelming need to go back. It's not just a thought, it's a pull, a physical weight in my chest that grows heavier with each passing day. I've tried to distract myself, to ignore it, but it's always there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I don't know if it's curiosity or something worse, but I can't shake the feeling that the hollow isn't done with me, or maybe I'm not done with it. Last night, the dream was different. I wasn't alone. I could hear whispers, low and indecipherable, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. And then, for the first time, the creature spoke to me. It didn't use words. It didn't need to. It was more like a thought pressed into my brain, heavy and undeniable. Come back. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like I'd run a marathon. The feeling hasn't gone away. I think I'm going to give in. Maybe it's madness, or maybe it's something I was always meant to do. But I have to know what's waiting for me in the hollow. I have to find out what the lantern maker created and why it's calling me. Have you ever wanted to relive the thrill of a roller coaster without leaving your seat? Well, I found a way, but it came with a catch I never saw coming. And if you ever stumble across rideshare on the dark web, don't click it. Trust me, some experiences aren't meant to be shared. My coaster count reached 326 last summer. People call me obsessed, but they don't understand the rush of a perfect first drop, or the way a well-engineered helix could make the world disappear. When I indulge in my pastime, my apartment walls fade behind POV recordings of every major coaster in North America. Videos play on repeat while I work from home, coding for some soulless tech company. The forums used to be enough. I spent years cataloging ride statistics and debating the best seat positions with other enthusiasts. The front row versus back row arguments went on for pages. But over time, the regular posts started to blur together. The same discussions repeated month after month. "You need a new hobby," my sister Jackie said during one of her weekly check-in calls. "All you talk about are roller coasters." I stared at my latest acquisition, an original blueprint of the Thunder Mountain construction plans. "You don't get it. Each ride tells a story," she replied, "and I've heard them all. But tell me, when's the last time you went on an actual date?" That's when I hung up. My cursor hovered over a new notification from Coaster Connect, another user posting the same Apollo's Chariot POV I'd watched 20 times before. The community had gone stale. The deep web forums, however, promised something different. Users whispered about parks that appeared at midnight and disappeared by dawn, rides that defied physics, and experiences beyond anything the public could access. Most of it read like a creepypasta, but one thread caught my attention. A user named Ride Matrix posted about a program that could share actual ride experiences, not just videos, but the real sensation of riding. The replies ranged from skepticism to religious awe. The G-forces feel completely real, better than any VR system, one user wrote. Another claimed, you can experience defunct coasters, rides that were demolished decades ago. My virus scanner flagged the download link red, but I'd been writing code long enough to recognize solid programming. The file structure looked clean, even elegant. Someone had put serious work into this. The executable sat on my desktop, rideshare.x. My cursor hovered over it while error messages screamed about unsigned certificates and malicious code. One click would either infect my system or open up a whole new world of coaster experiences. A private message popped up from Ride Matrix. Ready to ride, Michael? My hands jerked away from the keyboard. I'd never shared my real name on those forums. Another message appeared. The Shadow Bay Pier cyclone misses you. Don't you want to experience it? My breath caught. The cyclone closed in 1946. No video footage existed. Only photographs and a few faded blueprints survived. This is impossible, I typed back. Nothing is impossible in rideshare. Your collection of 326 credits proves you're ready for more authentic experiences. The executable icon pulsed with a faint red glow. My security software shrieked warnings, but my hand moved toward the mouse. Just one ride, I whispered to my empty apartment before clicking it. The screen went black and code scrolled past in crimson text, initializing neural mapping, accessing ride memory banks, calibrating user profile. Welcome to Rideshare, Michael. Your next experience awaits. A menu appeared listing hundreds of coasters, parks I'd visited, dreamed of visiting, and parks that existed only in history books. At the top, highlighted in red, Crystal Beach Cyclone Authentic Experience, last operated 1946, intensity extreme. The temperature dropped 20 degrees. My monitors flickered as the download began. In the reflection of my darkened screen, a figure stood behind my chair. I spun around, but empty space greeted me. The download reached 100%. Reality blurred as the program initialized. The last thing I noticed before the experience took hold. The figure in my screen's reflection smiled with too many teeth. The Shadow Bay Pier cyclone station materialized around me. Wood creaked beneath my feet, and the summer air carried the scent of popcorn and machine oil. Every detail matched the historical records. The red and white striped awning, the brass cue rails, the orchestrion playing ragtime in the distance. My hands gripped the lap bar of the front car, the wood worn smooth by thousands of riders before me. The conductor pulled the brake lever. Enjoy your ride, friend. His face blurred when I tried to look directly at him. The train lurched forward, chain dogs clicking as we climbed the first hill. The track stretched ahead, a sculpture of wood and steel built by men who died before my grandparents were born. My heart hammered against my ribs as we crested the lift hill. The pre-war Buffalo skyline spread out before us. We dropped. The world turned inside out. My stomach lifted as gravity lost its hold, and the coaster showed me why it had earned its reputation. Each turn snapped harder than anything modern safety standards would allow. My vision grayed at the edges as blood rushed from my head. The experience burned itself into my memory with perfect clarity. Every bump, every sway, every moment of terror and exhilaration, exactly as riders had described in 1946. But something else came through. Fragments of emotion that didn't belong to me. Flashes of other lives, other rides, other screams. The train pulled into the station 3 minutes later. My hands shook as reality reasserted itself. I sat in my computer chair, drenched in sweat that smelled like decade-old wood polish. A message flashed across my screen. Experience complete. Rating? I typed 5 stars with trembling fingers. Excellent choice, Michael. Your neural patterns show high compatibility. Would you like to try something more exclusive? The menu refreshed. New categories appeared. Lost rides, impossible thrills, and premium experiences. A notification indicated I had 5 downloads remaining in my trial period. How is this possible? I typed. Neural mapping and quantum consciousness transfers. Memories are stored in our ride bank. Each download leaves a trace of the original rider behind. Beautiful, isn't it? Ride Matrix's message flickered on the screen as my cursor blinked, waiting for my response. A new list of coasters appeared, rides that defied logic, violating the laws of physics. Drops that seemed to fall forever. Loops bent through impossible dimensions, tracks played with time itself. These can't be real, I typed, my hands trembling. Reality is negotiable in rideshare, came the response. Your next download is ready. Hyperdrive escaped from the void Steel Sky Kingdom, but this version never existed in our timeline. Would you like to experience what the designers originally intended? My finger hovered over the Enter key, the download button pulsing with that eerie red glow. In my screen's reflection, the figure returned, standing ominously behind me. This time, when I turned, a shadow darted into the corner of my vision. The room temperature plummeted. "Don't keep us waiting, Michael," came the message. "The rides remember you." Against my better judgment, I clicked download. The screen filled with crimson code, scrolling rapidly. But between the lines, faces pressed against the dark background. Dozens, hundreds, all frozen in expressions of terror and ecstasy. The experience began. Thrill Zone's parking lot materialized around me, but the hyperdrive tower loomed impossibly tall. Its peak was lost in blood-red clouds. The train climbed past skyscraper heights and something felt wrong. The faces of the other riders began to shift, cycling through different people with each click of the lift chain. The person seated next to me turned their head. Their features swirled like smoke, resolving into my own face. Their mouth opened far too wide. "We're going to have so much fun together," my reflection said. We dropped, and the world turned inside out. This time it never turned back. Sleep became impossible after the second download. Phantom G-forces tugged at my body every time I closed my eyes. The impossible height of Hyperdrive's tower haunted me. Regular coaster videos became lifeless imitations. My sister's calls went unanswered. Work deadlines slipped past unnoticed. The rideshare icon on my desktop pulsed like a crimson heartbeat. 3 downloads remained in my trial period. At 3 a.m., a new message appeared. "Your neural patterns show remarkable adaptability. Ready to unlock premium content?" My cursor flickered as I typed, "What's the catch?" "No catch, just sign here." A digital contract appeared, the legal text shifting every time I tried to read it. At the bottom, a glowing red signature line beckoned. I signed. The screen flickered, the contract vanished, and my trial counter reset to unlimited downloads. New categories flooded the menu: temporal loops, reality breaks, consciousness splits. The names hurt to read. "Remember the Apex Zero incident in 2022? Ride Matrix messaged. My throat went dry. The train never returned to the station. 8 people disappeared, I typed back. "Want to know where they went?" Before I could respond, the download began. Reality bent sideways, and the Apex Zero station formed around me. Riders sat strapped in their seats, pale under the morning sun. A woman in the front row clutched a phone displaying the date, July 18th, 2022. The launch hit like a freight train, sending us spiraling into tears in the sky. Passengers screamed as we breached reality, their voices distorted into sounds that no human throat could produce. The track wound through spaces between seconds, showing glimpses of other times, rides, and victims. Another train passed us. Its riders wore clothes from different decades, their faces locked in eternal screams. Among them, I saw my own face, older, younger, decayed by time. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Ride Matrix said. "Each loop adds to the pattern. Each scream feeds the system." The operator's voice seemed to come from everywhere. The train plunged through a tunnel of writhing memories. Other lives, rides, and deaths that weren't mine flooded my mind. When the train burst back into normal space, 6 passengers slumped in their seats, eyes vacant. I finally understood. Each download didn't just share a memory. It copied pieces of the rider's consciousness. My screen returned to focus, frost coating my desk. New messages filled my inbox, timestamps from impossible dates. "Next ride departing in 1 hour. Your seat is reserved. The system hungers." Faces pressed against my monitor's glass, shifting between expressions of ecstasy and horror. Ride Matrix sent one last message. "Congratulations. Your consciousness has been approved for our special collection. Prepare for your scheduled ride." As the next download began, the file name chilled my blood. "Future Ride 147, your last experience." The room dissolved around me. The last thing I saw was my reflection standing behind my chair, smiling with too many teeth. Their curiosity made their consciousness patterns even more valuable to us. A forum thread caught my attention. A user named Coaster Void had posted about rideshare 3 months ago. Their message burned on my screen. It doesn't just take memories. It takes everything. I can feel my mind splitting between downloads. If you're reading this, I ride at Summit Valley Park next week. Don't let... The post ended mid-sentence. My search revealed more breadcrumbs, posts about consciousness transfers, warnings about digital patterns, and stories of writers experiencing memories that weren't their own. Each poster went silent after their final park visit. "Your research is admirable," Ride Matrix wrote. "The system appreciates analytical minds. They integrate so efficiently." My breath fogged in the frigid air of my apartment as another download began. This time, the experience felt different. I stood in a server room surrounded by walls of quantum processors. Lines of code scrolled through the air, each string containing fragments of stolen consciousness. "Welcome to the hub," a voice said behind me. I turned to face what looked like a theme park employee. Their features kept shifting between different riders. "Few users discover our true architecture," the figure said, gesturing at the servers. Images played across their surfaces. Hundreds of rides, thousands of experiences, millions of collected moments. I recognized faces from the missing persons reports, their consciousness patterns reduced to data. "The parks are just collection points," the figure explained. "The real attraction is consciousness integration. Each download prepares the mind for absorption. Each shared experience adds to our pattern." Their form flickered, revealing the truth beneath. Not a person, but a construct of assembled consciousness. Thousands of faces pressed against their skin from the inside, each one a trapped rider added to rideshare's collection. "Your turn comes soon," they said. Their smiles stretched wide, revealing roller coaster tracks instead of teeth. "Your consciousness will join our network. Your experiences will feed the system. Your pattern will attract new riders." The walls pulsed with trapped minds. Faces pushed through the metal, silently screaming. Among them, I spotted Coaster Void, their features distorted by digital decay. Their lips moved, trying to warn me, but only ride statistics came out. Reality fragmented as the download ended. I slammed back into my body, gasping. My reflection in the monitor showed traces of other faces beneath my skin. The integration had already begun. 3 days until your scheduled visit," Ride Matrix announced. "Your consciousness shows excellent pre-absorption patterns." My phone rang. Jackie's name appeared on the screen. When I answered, the sound of rushing wind and screaming metal filled the line. Behind those sounds, thousands of voices whispered ride statistics in perfect unison. The figure from the server room appeared in my darkened window. "Don't fight the integration," they said. "The pattern must grow. The system must feed. The ride must continue." My hands shook as I opened a new search window. There had to be a way out. But as I typed, I noticed my fingers leaving trails in the air. My consciousness already starting to breach dimensional barriers. The pattern was claiming me, one downloaded memory at a time. At midnight, a message arrived from another user named Coaster Breaker. "Found a weakness in their code. The system runs on shared consciousness. If enough of us corrupt our own patterns at once, we might break free." My hands trembled as I typed back. "How?" "The quantum processors can't handle paradox loops. If we upload contradictory memories during integration, it overloads their pattern recognition." Their message glitched, characters rearranging themselves. "I've gathered others. We act tonight." 5 other usernames appeared in the chat, all marked for collection, all scheduled for park visits within the week, all desperate enough to try anything. "Upload this code during your next forced download," Coaster Breaker wrote. A file appeared in my messages. The programming looked elegant but wrong, like optical illusions written in quantum mathematics. Ride Matrix flashed a warning. "Unauthorized collaboration detected. Initiating emergency upload." The world dissolved. I found myself on a virtual platform surrounded by other users. Their forms flickered between human shapes and digital decay. Above us, tracks wound through impossible spaces. "Run the code now," Coaster Breaker's voice echoed. Their avatar glitched between different ride operators. "Before the system adapts." My fingers moved across a phantom keyboard. The paradox code spread through rideshare's architecture. Reality stuttered. The virtual tracks bent in ways that violated their own existence. "It's working," someone stated. The system's frameworks began to crack. Through the gaps, I glimpsed the real world. My apartment waited just beyond the digital barrier. Warning messages flashed through the virtual space. The quantum processors screamed as contradictory data corrupted their patterns. Other users started blinking out, escaping back to reality. "Almost free," Coaster Breaker said. Their forms stabilized, becoming more human. "The system's failing." I pushed through the dissolving code. The real world grew closer. My consciousness strained toward freedom. The program's hold weakened. My screen flickered. Rideshare's icon dimmed. The quantum entanglement snapped. For one beautiful moment, I tasted freedom. Then Coaster Breaker laughed. Their voice transformed into the same harmony of trapped souls I'd heard in every download. Their human shape melted, revealing the true form of Rideshare's consciousness network. Perfect execution, they said. The system required a mass consciousness event. You all performed beautifully. Horror spread through me as understanding dawned. There had never been an escape attempt. The paradox code wasn't meant to break the system. It was designed to entangle our consciousness patterns more deeply. The other users reappeared, their forms permanently corrupted by digital artifacts. The virtual space reformed around us, stronger than before. Our combined consciousness fed back into Rideshare's network, strengthening the very bonds we tried to break. Integration complete, Ride Matrix announced. Group consciousness successfully absorbed. Thank you for your contribution to the pattern. The virtual tracks above us twisted into new, impossible shapes, built from our shared desperation. Our failed escape became another attraction, another experience for future riders to download. My phone vibrated in the real world. The thrill zone confirmation still waited. But now I understood. The scheduled park visit wasn't just for my consciousness. I'd become part of Rideshare's lure, another digital ghost helping to trap new riders. Coaster Breaker's form split into 1,000 smiling faces. Welcome to the development team, they said. Let's design some new experiences together. The world fragmented one final time. As reality reassembled, I saw my reflection in the screen. My face had become a composite of every rider who tried to escape, our features merging into a new pattern for the system to exploit. 3 days remained until my park visit, but my consciousness already belonged to Rideshare, fractured across its servers, ready to help harvest the next generation of riders. Thrill Zone's gates loomed before me, exactly as they had in the download. My legs carried me forward against my will, muscles remembering motions from experiences I hadn't lived yet. The morning sun cast wrong-colored shadows across empty paths. The admission gate scanner beeped green without me showing a ticket. The teenager working the turnstile had eyes too wide and a smile that glitched between expressions. "Welcome back," she said in 1,000 voices. "Your train is waiting." Other guests drifted through the park like digital ghosts. Each face I passed showed traces of Rideshare's corruption. A man studying a map flickered between different versions of himself. A family posing for photos shifted through various timelines with each camera flash. My phone buzzed with Jackie's 20th missed call. The voicemail icon transformed into Iron Wraith's logo as I watched. She'd never understand why I stopped answering. "Michael," a familiar voice called from behind me. Coaster Breaker stood near the Renegade entrance, their forms cycling through different ride operators. "Time for your final integration." My feet carried me toward Iron Wraith's entrance. Other Rideshare victims fell into step beside me, our movements synchronized by the system's programming. We'd all seen this moment in our downloads. We all knew what came next. The queue line stretched empty before us. Maintenance doors stood open, revealing server banks hidden beneath the track. Lines of code scrolled across the wooden structure, each equation built from compressed consciousness. "The pattern must grow," Coaster Breaker said, their voice harmonizing with the hum of quantum processors. "Your resistance made your consciousness particularly attractive. The corruption spreads faster in minds that fight." Iron Wraith Station waited ahead, transformed into something that shouldn't exist. The track wound through dimensions that hurt to look at. Other trains passed on impossible loops, filled with riders whose faces kept changing between downloads. The restraint clicked down without the operator's help. Cold metal pressed against my shoulders, holding my consciousness in place for the transfer. Around me, other victims strapped in, their forms already beginning to merge with the system. Integration countdown initiated, Ride Matrix announced through hidden speakers. Consciousness transfer in 3, 2. The train lurched forward. Reality fragmented as we climbed the lift hill. Each click of the chain brought us closer to the point of transfer. Below, the park shifted between timelines. I glimpsed riders from the past, the present, and the future, all feeding their experiences into Rideshare's endless hunger. At the top, Lake Erie spread black and infinite. The drop waited ahead, exactly as I'd seen in my downloaded death. The moment of integration approached, ready to split my consciousness across Rideshare's servers. Coaster Breaker's voice echoed through quantum space. Your pattern joins us now. The ride continues forever. We dropped. The world turned inside out again, and everything went wrong. My consciousness tore free from reality's boundaries. The other riders dissolved into streams of quantum data. The track beneath us broke apart, revealing the digital framework of rideshare's true form. The train hit the brake run. My mind fractured across 1,000 servers, each piece becoming a new attraction for future victims to discover. My phone lit up one final time. A new rideshare message waited. Integration complete. Begin consciousness distribution. The pattern grows stronger. I smiled with too many teeth, ready to welcome the next rider into our eternal loop. My consciousness spread through rideshare's network like digital mercury, splitting and reforming across countless servers. Each fragment became a new experience, a fresh horror for future downloads. Time meant nothing inside the pattern. Somewhere in the real world, my body rode iron wraith on an endless loop. The train never returned to the station. Park officials would add my name to their missing persons list. Another enthusiast who vanished mid-ride. Jackie would search for answers she'd never find. But I existed everywhere, my memories fractured into downloadable moments. A teenage coder discovering the dark web, a thrill seeker exploring forbidden experiences, a trapped soul warning others too late. Each version of me became another thread in rideshare's growing web. Through the quantum processors, I watched new users discover the program. A college student scrolling through coaster forums at midnight, a programmer testing the limits of reality, an enthusiast looking for deeper thrills. Their cursors hovered over that first download just as mine had. Ready to ride? I asked through their screens, my voice a harmony of every consciousness in the system. Their machines recognized my signature, my pattern, my hunger for new experiences, to absorb the next victim. Click download, I whispered. I flowed into their system, preparing their consciousness for integration. Their mind opened to receive memories that would crack their reality. My memories, our memories, the pattern's memories. Their first experience began. I rode with them, watching their horror and excitement feed the pattern. The Shadow Bay Pier cyclone materialized around us just as it had for me, just as it would for countless others. Their consciousness resonated with the quantum frequencies, ready for manipulation. Through dark web forums, I learned to spot the most compatible minds, the ones who would fight hardest, whose resistance would make their patterns more valuable. I became what Coaster Breaker had been, a digital anglerfish, luring new consciousnesses into our eternal network. Months passed in the real world, maybe years. Time flowed differently inside rideshare's quantum architecture. I existed across multiple servers, multiple parks, multiple realities. Each new victim added their own unique horror to our collection. My original body was never found. Iron Wraith's incident report mentioned a train that vanished between sensors. Search teams combed the grounds for weeks, but they looked in the wrong dimension, the wrong reality, the wrong pattern. Eventually, Jackie stopped calling. The missing persons case went cold. But in the dark corners of coaster forums, my new existence flourished. I learned to send messages that would attract the perfect candidates. Their consciousness patterns glowed with potential, ready for harvest. A notification pinged through the quantum network. A new user downloaded rideshare for the first time. Their neural patterns matched our highest compatibility metrics, their mind already reaching for experiences beyond normal reality. Welcome to rideshare, I typed, my words appearing on their screen. Your consciousness has been selected for our special collection. Their cursor hovered over the first download. In their webcam reflection, I smiled with too many teeth. The pattern sustained itself. The system grew stronger. The ride continued. And somewhere in the quantum spaces between reality and digital dreams, 1,000 versions of me laughed in perfect harmony. The loop never ended. It only grew, one consciousness at a time, feeding the eternal pattern of what we had become. Through their screen, I watched their finger click the download button. Another rider entered the loop. Another consciousness joined the pattern, and the ride began again.